Good evening, dear friend. Today you will travel to the island where the Medusa Gorgon lived, and you will find out why she became a monster. But first, tell me what time it is, and what country you are from. To fully immerse yourself, you need to relax. Rest your hands, let your breath lengthen, and allow the day to loosen its hold. Close your eyes if you like. Let the tide of old names carry us under. We step together toward a shoreline where gods once walked like weather, and every whisper left a monument. Night hushes the world, and the sea has the last word. I'm glad you're here. Have you ever wondered how beauty can turn like a season, soft as spring at dawn and yet capable of winter's stone? Rest your hands, let your breath lengthen, and allow the day to loosen its hold. Close your eyes if you like. Let the tide of old names carry us under. We step together toward a shoreline where gods once walked, like weather, and every whisper left a monument. Part 1. Along the edge of the Aegean, a silver path lies across the water, a needle of moonlight stitching island to island. In that mild shimmer, temples wear their shadows like shawls, and the surf repeats a patient word, as if rehearsing a spell. Time is not a straight road here. It is a cove where echoes circle, and yesterday can wash up at your feet like driftwood smoothed by hands. Among those echoes, one name rises with the tide. Medusa. Before scales, before hissing crowns, before the hush that falls when a traveller meets her eyes, there was a girl who walked barefoot across cool flagstones and knew the temple's birds by their morning songs. She was a mortal child in a world that loved to bargain with immortals. She learned that the sea had moods, and that storms could be the thought of a single mind under the blue. Her city faced the sea, and in the blue hours fisherwomen mended nets at the quay, and told stories meant to keep little ones from leaning too far over the water. They spoke of salt kings and horse lords, of bright-eyed wisdom walking as a maiden through markets. They said some beauties draw fortune, others trouble, some draw both, braided as rope. Medusa listened with her chin in her palm, keeping her smile small. Beauty is only the outermost ripple, she thought, and the true water flows deeper where eyes do not always look. She grew tall, not like a spear, but like a reed, supple and music-ready. The priestesses saw a steadiness in her hands and a humility that matched the cool light of dawn. They taught her to wash stone with rosewater, to comb embroidered fringes, to carry flame without spilling it. In the sanctuary she learned silence, not absence but the fullness of listening. There were rules. In houses where gods take supper, rules are the table. Purity mattered. Pride must stay thin as a shadow. Visitors came, sailors with sea-bitten knuckles, merchants with wind maps folded in their brains, mothers with salt and worry on their brows. They left offerings, not to buy favour, but to create a little balance in a world inclined to tilt. Medusa arranged the offerings, set figs in bowls like planets, laid down strands of wool, poured wine that held the light. She was not a priestess yet, but the temple leaned toward her as vines lean toward the sun. There were omens, light as feathers. A snake shed its skin beneath the laurel by the gate, leaving a ghost of itself. A delicate stocking of scales. A mirror took too long to give back a face, as if thinking. Once a fisherman drew up a stone with the net, smooth as an egg. When he cracked it in play, a pearl of water rolled out and did not break, only sat and trembled. The old women nodded to each other, as if to say the sea was practicing its tricks. Medusa felt a quiet at the base of the day, like hearing a drum before the procession turns the corner. In dreams she walked along the seabed as if across a meadow, the fronds brushing her shins like grass. Horses with manes of foam cantered in the distance. A shadow like a mountain breathed. She woke with the taste of brine on her lips and the sense of being watched by something older than cliff or wave. Dreams are letters the body writes to the soul. Using an alphabet of tides, she kept them folded under the pillow of her days, and did not speak them aloud. Not every knowing invites a listener. The gods prefer to overhear what we hide. One morning the city smelled of rain, though the sky was perfectly blue, a sign that weather was thinking about a change. Medusa braided her hair and tied it with a cord dyed with crushed murex. She carried lilies to the altar and set them in a bronze throat of a vase. The petals looked like hands refusing an argument. She had no reason to fear anything. A life lived in balance knows its own centre. Yet the quiet question she had felt in the air had begun to echo against the jar of her heart. Children ran like sparks along the colonnade, their laughter a sail. A potter's wheel purred. Gulls argued over nothing. Far offshore, an island put on a veil of haze, as brides do when they need courage. The high priestess, whose hair was dove-grey, paused while stepping down and glanced toward the harbour. Some glances are small doors. Lives walk through. Through that glance, fate placed one sandaled foot upon the first stair. The hinge was small, the door would be wide. Remember this hour, and keep it near your heartbeat. The scent of time, the shine of the lily, the mirror thinking too long. Some transformations arrive like storms. Others begin as a hush in a familiar room. A girl can be both safe and nearly finished with safety at once. A city can bless her with praise and at the same time build the echo chamber that will carry her name to cliffs. The sea keeps its counsel, but it loves to involve itself with destinies that glitter. Somewhere, a god attends to a disturbance like a change in current. Somewhere, a goddess sets her jaw for a lesson that will not be simple. The tide rises by a finger's width, and nobody yet measures it. A bronze bell waits to be touched by the wind. In the courtyard, a hair-thin crack veined a libation bowl. A lizard paused upon a warm step, and the oldest olive lifted its leaves as if to listen. A boy balanced a jar and did not spill. A dog pricked its ears at nothing. A swallow cut a crescent in the sky, then turned as though remembering an older road. No one marked these things, and yet the world had already leaned a fraction toward the tale it would have to tell. The marble kept its chill. Along the harbour, morning ripened into pale gold. Medusa's hands remembered their duties before thought could catch them. Sweep the threshold, draw fresh water, lift the veil from the image whose eyes were carved to look past the world and into the order beneath. She moved quietly, not from fear but from respect for a stillness older than cliff or song. The high priestess watched her as a navigator watches a star. "Keep the east door latched," she had murmured once, and Medusa did, though she wondered why. The east is for beginnings. That afternoon the latch slipped of its own accord and clicked shut behind her, as if to remind the living of their smallness. She smiled and set it right, yet felt the air grow thoughtful. By the shore, the fisherwomen spoke of currents that misbehaved. Far out, a dark back rose and sank, the sea making room for it without fuss. The city had plenty of gods. One of them had decided to lean closer. When Medusa carried the libation bowl, its hairline crack showed like a vein beneath skin. A ripple trembled on the wine and stilled, though no breeze moved. She felt observed, not as prey feels a hunter, but as a singer feels an audience before the first note. She lifted the bowl anyway, because ritual is a bridge built step by step, even if the far shore is fog. The inner court held a pool, small as a held breath, fed by a trickle from a lion's mouth. Medusa knelt at dusk to wash the lily's stems. In the water she saw her face as the world saw it. Composed, fine-boned, touched by a brightness not entirely hers. Beauty in a shrine is alone. She treated it as one treats borrowed silk, aware that hands wait to receive it back. Word of her grace ran like rumour. Boys lifted heavier amphorae when she passed. Women appraised her with that mixture of blessing and warning that mothers hand their daughters. Praise is a warm room, but it can smother. She kept the door cracked to let a breeze through. That night, her dream took her under the waves to a colonnade of green water. Between the fluted pillars moved a figure, the colour of stormlight. Where it strode, horses formed from foam and galloped in place. Medusa bowed as one does before weather one cannot defy, and woke with her heart steady as if it had been instructed. Morning brought a procession. Sailors entered barefoot. Then came a stranger. Alone, his cloak dark with a wetness that did not seem from rain. He smelled of distance. He did not look at the goddess. He looked at Medusa as if she were a compass. There was no hunger in it, only intention, and she felt the world tilt a grain toward a point she could not see. The stranger laid a token on the step, a piece of shell polished to a mirror by the sea. When she glanced at it, it did not return her face. Instead, it showed a sky roped with cloud and a foal learning to stand. She flinched at the odd mercy of it. The high priestess's head turned, and for a heartbeat, the air between them tightened like thread. Then it slackened. The stranger bowed to no one and departed. After he left, the temple seemed larger, as if a wall had shifted outward. Medusa worked until her knuckles reddened, grateful for fatigue, yet she felt watched again at the pool, this time by a different mind, a clarity like the edge of a blade that cuts only lies. The carved eyes of the goddess, wise, cool, sleepless, regarded her with something she had not earned and could not refuse, notice. Wisdom travels. It knows when a shape in the world is becoming a lesson. Perhaps the goddess had drifted over Medusa before and warned herself not to favour a mortal. Either way, the air began to ring with a quiet that was not absence but decision. Medusa had been promised to the sanctuary's discipline. It asks for modest steps, for days like beads of humble shine. She had tied her beauty to obedience so that both would not blow loose in one of the sea's quick moods. Yet fame found a gap under the door and seeped in around her sandals. At the harbour a net brought up a braid of seaweed that coiled upon itself and made for a breath the impression of a crown. Children shrieked. An old man spat for luck. The mirror in the antechamber delayed again, as if searching its memory. On the third evening after the stranger's visit, clouds rose from the horizon like new mountains. The city lit lamps early, Medusa trimmed wicks, thunder walked behind the islands. The high priestess touched the lintel and whispered to no one that could be seen. Medusa set the lilies aside and brought in fresh laurel. The leaves flashed their pale undersides like fish. When the first drops touched the flagstones slow and cold, the scent of the world changed. The rain came not as cleansing but as statement. The way a law arrives, irrevocable. In that hour rules mattered more than ever. And yet within that hour a rule would be broken, not by malice but by forces that do not honour human maps. A boundary lives in every temple. A boundary lives also in the sea. She stood under the portico and listened to the meeting of those two minds, threshold and tide. Between them a mortal body, breathing, devoted, unarmed but for a sense of right order. Somewhere a god weighed sweetness against pride, somewhere a goddess weighed mercy against example. The rain thickened, and the east door which had been latched quivered as if remembering its own will. Medusa reached for it, not yet knowing whether to steady the wood or to let it speak in the slow rain. Her fingers brushed the latch, cool with rain, and in that moment the temple seemed to hold its breath. The wood trembled as though some presence leaned against it from the other side. Not demanding entry, but waiting for her hand to consent. She hesitated, feeling the weight of choice in something so small as a lifted bar. The storm's voice deepened and a shiver passed through the stone floor, not of fear but of arrival. When she loosened the latch, the door moved not outward but inward, as if the boundary itself had turned traitor. The chamber filled with the scent of salt, sharper than any harbour breeze. The air thickened until each inhalation felt like drinking from the tide, and through the threshold came a silence that was not empty but watchful, and behind it the slow steps of a power accustomed to worship rather than request. Poseidon entered not as a figure clothed in flesh alone, but as a tide wearing the mask of a man. His hair carried the wet gleam of kelp, his cloak dragged droplets that hissed upon the warm stone, and his eyes were the rolling depths where light is both trapped and devoured. He filled the chamber as easily as water finds cracks. The high priestess, startled, stepped forward to rebuke, but her voice caught in her throat. A god chooses his audience. Mortals may protest, but stone remembers only what the god wills. Medusa bowed, yet even in her reverence she felt the disquiet of being singled out. She was no priestess anointed, only a servant of rituals. But Poseidon's gaze did not waver. It moved across her as the sea measures a shore, noting where the cliffs hold and where they crumble. She lowered her eyes, and in that downward glance the lilies she had placed earlier seemed suddenly too fragile, too human to endure what now stirred. "Why here?" the high priestess whispered hoarsely, though her words were as feeble as reeds in wind. The god did not answer her. Instead, the thunder rolled more heavily outside and the rain thickened to a curtain. The goddess of wisdom, whose likeness stood unmoving in stone, seemed to sharpen her gaze within her marble face. Athena's silence became a presence, not absence, as if she were watching the sacrilege unfold, considering her own response. Poseidon's attention remained upon Medusa, not cruel, not tender, but inevitable, to be seen so completely as a weight few bodies can hold. She trembled, not from cold but from the strangeness of it, the sense that her beauty, once a gift offered carefully to the gods, was now a beacon against which even divinity leaned. She did not speak. She had no right to speak. The god's will unfolded like a tide advancing. What passed in that chamber could never be named in the language of markets or hearths. The rain hammered, the torches hissed and bent. Somewhere in the depths of the sanctuary, a bronze bowl overturned with a sound like a cracked bell. When at last Poseidon withdrew, leaving behind him the scent of brine and the echo of waves still breaking, Medusa knelt upon the wet stone, her veil torn, her breath broken. The silence afterward was heavier than his presence had been. The high priestess covered her face, torn between pity and fear. To her mind, the sanctuary's law had been fractured, not by Medusa's will, but by her helplessness. Yet the goddess who presided here was not merciful by nature. Athena's image glared from the niche, her eyes carved to pierce deceit, her lips closed in judgment. The statue did not move, yet its stillness carried accusation sharper than speech. Medusa tried to rise, her knees slipping against the water pooled across the marble floor. Shame clung to her like a second skin. Though she had sought nothing, summoned nothing, she wanted to run into the storm, to be lost among the waves rather than endure the gaze of that stony goddess. But the high priestess seized her arm, half in protection, half in dread, and whispered, "Stay, child. Do not leave the altar yet." Night dragged itself forward with the storm. The city slept poorly, for thunder rattled the shutters, and fishermen muttered charms against ill luck. In the sanctuary, Medusa sat against a pillar, eyes swollen from weeping. She no longer felt the temple's safety. Its walls seemed complicit in what had transpired. Every carved figure, every polished surface reflected her in fragments, broken, distorted. Beauty, once her silent ally, had become unbearable. When dawn arrived, raw and pale, the rain slackened, but the sea roared still, unwilling to calm. The high priestess prepared offerings threefold, desperate to placate the goddess who had been dishonored beneath her very roof. She placed laurel, honey, and oil upon the flame, murmuring prayers until her lips dried, yet the air remained tense, brittle as glass before a shatter. Medusa, pale from sleeplessness, moved to gather the remnants of the lilies. Their petals, bruised and translucent, looked like hands raised in surrender. She could hardly touch them without breaking them further. As she carried them toward the refuse, the floor beneath her seemed to echo too loudly, as though the temple itself wished to mark her steps. Behind her, the carved image of Athena glimmered in the first thin line of sun. The goddess's anger was wordless but palpable, as though the statue's gaze had deepened into the very marrow of the air. Medusa turned slightly, caught by that gaze, and for the first time felt the shift of her own reflection within it. Her beauty no longer felt her own. It seemed borrowed, corrupted, and about to be judged. The high priestess trembled at the silence, knowing what it might mean when gods perceive impurity within their sacred halls. She dared not speak the thought, but every fibre in her knew that punishment was drawing near, not only upon Medusa but upon all who had harboured her. For when divinity is offended, even innocence does not shield the vessel of that offence. Medusa pressed her hands together, whispering an apology that dissolved before it reached the air. She prayed not to the Sea Lord who had broken into her world, but to the goddess whose wrath now loomed. Yet forgiveness is not always the language of gods. The storm had passed, but another, colder, had just begun to gather its clouds, and as the first shafts of light spilled across the temple floor, they revealed more than daybreak. They revealed the shadow of judgment rising, silent and inescapable. The shadow of judgment did not need thunder to announce itself. It moved with a stillness so intense that every sound in the sanctuary seemed out of place. Even the lion's mouth fountain slowed, its trickle hesitant, as though unsure whether water was permitted to flow in the presence of divine anger. The high priestess, though aged and accustomed to omens, could not steady her breath. She felt the weight of Athena's unseen eyes, and feared the shattering of an order she had devoted her life to guard. Medusa stood at the centre, trembling, her veil clutched against her chest, as if cloth could shield her from a gaze older than marble. She longed to explain, to cry that she had been no willing guest of the Sea Lord's intrusion. But what word could reach ears carved from eternal stone? The sanctuary's silence was already verdict enough. Gods are not swayed by mortal pleas. They read truth as easily as mortals read the lines of the palm. From the east wall, Athena's likeness seemed to sharpen in the first light. The sculpted eyes, unmoving yet all-seeing, fixed upon the trembling girl. To Medusa, it felt as though the statue breathed, drawing in her shame and preparing to exhale judgment. The air thickened until her knees weakened beneath her. She clung to the pillar and closed her eyes, but even behind the veil of lashes she felt the unbearable brightness of divine attention. Then came a sound without sound. a voice that entered not through ears but through the marrow itself. It was not rage shouted but law spoken, and law needs no volume to crush. Athena's presence unfurled across the sanctuary, vast, merciless, inevitable. The high priestess fell prostrate, forehead to stone, whispering fragments of prayers that scattered like dry leaves in a storm. Medusa felt her hair lift slightly, as though stirred by a current not of wind but of will. The skin along her arms prickled. Her body was still her own, but it was being measured, weighed, and found in violation of a vow she had never broken willingly. In that cruel balance, innocence mattered little. What counted was that sacred ground had been desecrated, and someone must bear the mark of consequence. The goddess's judgment descended like iron through water. A heat spread across Medusa's scalp, sharp and alien, as if each strand of hair were igniting into its own life. She gasped, clutching at her head, only to feel movement, slithering, restless, alive. Her fingers recoiled from the writhing that replaced her familiar braids. Around her face, serpents uncoiled, their scales shimmering like wet bronze, their tongues tasting the air with soft, sinister flickers. She screamed, but the cry came out distorted, laced with a hiss that was not hers. The sound echoed cruelly against the stone walls. The high priestess dared to lift her head, and at once wished she had not. One glance into Medusa's changing eyes, once bright, mortal and soft, was enough to strike terror into her bones. Within them gleamed a light not human, not gentle, but piercing, petrifying, as though the gaze itself sought to arrest time and freeze the beating heart. Medusa staggered to the pool, desperate to see what she had become. The water reflected her face, and she recoiled. Where once beauty had lived, now horror stared back. Her cheeks were still delicate, her features still fine, but framed by serpents and crowned with a gaze too sharp for any mortal to endure. Her beauty had become an instrument of fear. The pool trembled, its surface quaking as if even water could not hold her image steadily. Tears welled in her eyes, but as they fell, the serpents hissed, unsettled by the salt. She pressed her palms against the floor, begging silently for release. But Athena's judgment was not given to soothe. It was given to teach, to defile her temple, whether by will or by violation, was to invite a lesson that would echo across generations. Medusa, innocent yet chosen as vessel, would become that echo. The high priestess, still prostrate, dared at last to speak. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Forgive her, lady, the fault was not hers," but the silence that followed was sharper than denial. Forgiveness was not the lesson was fear, fear of transgression, fear of pride, fear of mortal beauty that drew gods to folly. Medusa was no longer a girl who tended lilies. She had been remade into a living boundary stone, a warning carved not of marble but of flesh and curse. As she rose unsteadily, the serpents lifted with her, their bodies weaving together like restless braids of night. Her steps left wet prints across the marble, each mark darkening as if shadow clung to her heels. The high priestess crawled back, unable to bear the sight of her once beloved novice. Her heart broke with pity, but her fear was greater still. To look again might be to lose motion forever. Medusa reached the threshold and paused. The storm had passed outside. The world smelled of washed earth and renewal, yet for her no renewal awaited. The door that once opened to duty and ritual now opened to exile. She understood this without being told. The sanctuary was no longer hers. The city would no longer embrace her. Wherever she went, her gaze would be curse, her beauty a weapon she never wished to wield. The serpents twined restlessly, as though sensing the truth of their new dominion. Each hiss was a chorus of endings. Medusa stepped into the morning light, veiled not by linen but by dread. The horizon seemed vast, yet she felt smaller within it than she ever had. She walked away from the temple that had shaped her, carrying with her not devotion but transformation. Behind her the sanctuary stood silent, its stone goddess unmoved, its lesson carved into the fate of a single mortal girl. Ahead stretched cliffs and forests, seas and caves, but no home. The earth itself seemed cautious under her steps, as if uncertain whether to welcome or fear this altered being. Somewhere in the distance, fishermen mended nets. Mothers hushed their children, and the world continued, unaware that its order had tilted. And within her chest, the beat of her heart sounded no longer like a girl's hope, but like the slow, unyielding drum of destiny beginning its march. The cliffs opened before her, like the edge of the world, their faces scarred by centuries of waves gnawing at their stone. Medusa walked where the path crumbled, her bare feet brushing dust that once had been mountain. The morning sun, gentle on the city's tiled roofs, fell harsh upon the desolation she entered. Wind coiled in her serpents, ruffling their scales, and they stirred uneasily, tasting the air with suspicion. She drew her veil lower, but linen could not soften what lived now within her gaze. Villagers who glimpsed her along the road recoiled. Some dropped baskets, spilling figs and olives onto the dust. Others crossed themselves with desperate signs, whispering charms to ward away ill luck. None dared approach. Medusa longed to beg them not to fear, to cry that her curse harmed only those who dared her eyes, but her throat sealed shut each time. Words seemed dangerous, as though they too might carry the petrifying edge of her presence. She learned that silence was safer than truth. By night she sheltered among rocks, curled against cold stone while the serpents coiled restlessly about her shoulders. They were companions she had not chosen, but they never left her. Sometimes, in half-sleep, she imagined they whispered, their voices sibilant yet strangely tender, like lullabies in a language older than men. At times she hated them, striking at them with trembling hands, but they only hissed softly and reformed their braids. Other times she wept into them, and they wound around her arms as though they understood. In her loneliness, even their cold affection was a thread of solace. Days passed, and the sea became her truest neighbour. She climbed down to hidden coves where waves curled themselves into caves, sighing secrets into the dark. There she drank from rainwater pools, and gazed at her reflection only when forced. Each glance tore at her heart, for beauty still lingered in her features, yet it was caged within terror. Her face was both gift and weapon, her eyes both wonder and doom. She could not reconcile the two halves, and so she ceased to look, preferring blindness to the cruel reminder. One evening she heard footsteps above her cove. A shepherd, searching for a stray lamb, wandered too near the cliff's edge. His voice carried, soft, calling the creature by name. Medusa froze, her serpents twitching. She dared not reveal herself, yet fate was already unfolding. The lamb stumbled down toward the rocks where she hid, bleating. The boy followed, slipping on loose stone, and before Medusa could flee, his gaze fell upon her. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat. His eyes widened, surprise blooming into terror, then stiffening into stillness. He became stone, his outstretched hand fixed forever toward the lamb that had fled. Medusa shrieked and covered her face, falling to her knees. The serpents hissed triumphantly, as though proud of their power, but she pressed her hands over her ears to drown them. The boy's silence was more terrible than any hiss, and she wept until the tide washed around her ankles, as if the sea itself tried to pull her grief away. She fled the cove and climbed higher into the wild hills, where no herdsman wandered. There she found caverns deep and secret, their mouths black as morning. One such cave became her refuge. Its walls sweated with damp. Its roof glimmered faintly with crystals that caught fire when the moonlight crept in. She named it her shelter, though it felt more a tomb. Within, her sobs echoed until they no longer sounded human, until even she could not tell if they belonged to her or to the serpents who mourned with her. As seasons turned, stories spread. In markets, women whispered of a monster with hair of vipers, whose gaze could freeze a man before his breath left his throat. Sailors spoke of her haunting the cliffs, her cries mingling with the surf, a warning never to look too closely at beauty in the wild. The name Gorgon began to take root, a word of fear that carried her away from the girl she had been. Medusa listened to these rumors carried on the wind, and though they cut her, she could not deny their truth. Her own life had become myth while she still breathed it. Yet in solitude she began to change in subtler ways. Her steps grew quieter, more attuned to stone and shadow. Her breath aligned with the rhythms of cave and tide. She learned to weave with her serpents, to move as one body. The girl who once tended lilies in a sanctuary now commanded silence in the wild. Her beauty had not vanished. It had sharpened into something more dangerous, more enduring. She did not yet accept it, but she began to sense the inevitability of her fate. The gods above did not speak to her again. Athena withheld comfort, Poseidon withheld acknowledgement. Their silence became its own prison, heavier than walls, yet perhaps the silence taught her more than their words could have. That she was no longer theirs to shape, she was something new, belonging neither wholly to gods nor mortals. Her tragedy was her own, and in that lonely claim flickered the first spark of power. Still, she longed for gentleness. Some nights she dreamt of her younger self, hands perfumed with rose water, arranging offerings with patient care. She would wake with tears on her cheeks and serpents curled tight against her throat. As though trying to hold her together, she would whisper apologies into the dark for the shepherd, for her city, for herself. But the cave gave no reply, only the eternal drip of water wearing stone thin. One dawn, while pale light spilled like milk into her cave, she stood at its mouth and gazed over the restless sea. The world beyond continued in ignorance of her sorrow. Fishermen set sail, lovers clasped hands in shaded courtyards, children laughed in their games. Medusa knew she could never step among them again. Her place was here, apart, an exile whose name grew heavier each time it was spoken. And yet, beneath the grief, a strange strength was rising, coiling like the serpents at her brow, waiting for the moment when destiny would demand its full unfurling. The strange strength that coiled within her did not arrive all at once. It grew like roots seeking water, slow and unseen. Medusa felt it first in her solitude, when days stretched empty yet filled with the rhythm of her survival. She learned to move through her cavern as though it were an extension of her body, every stalactite and curve of stone known to her fingers. The serpents, once a burden of terror, began to move in harmony with her thoughts. Their hisses shifting from chaos to chorus, they became her shadows, her guardians, perhaps even her only friends. In time she noticed how the earth itself responded to her presence. Birds did not roost in the trees above her cave, they circled wide, unsettled by what they sensed beneath. Deer that once wandered the cliffs now avoided the paths she walked, as though an invisible scent warned them away. Even the tide, faithful companion, rose higher at the mouth of her cave, as if drawn to her heartbeat. She did not command these things, yet they unfolded around her as naturally as breath. She wondered if exile had made her a creature not merely of solitude, but of dominion. Still, the memory of what had been haunted her. When she pressed her forehead against the damp stone, she could almost smell lilies again, hear the quiet bustle of the temple, feel the weight of rosewater in her palms. But the image always dissolved, replaced by the boy frozen in terror, the villagers' gasps, the silence of the high priestess who had once guided her. Dreams too betrayed her. They showed her face as it had been, lovely and untouched, only to fracture into scales and serpents as she reached toward it. Sleep gave her beauty, waking tore it away. Word of her spread faster than she travelled. Fishermen carried her name across islands. Shepherds whispered her story as warning to wandering children. In each telling she became less a girl and more a creature, her humanity stripped away by fear. Some called her demon, some goddess, others monster. The word Medusa grew heavier, the syllables thick with dread. She was still herself within her cave, still breathing, still grieving, but beyond her solitude she had become legend. It was then that hunters came. Drawn by rumours of her power, 2 men with spears approached the cliffs, speaking in hushed tones of the riches they would win if they returned with proof of her defeat. Medusa heard their voices long before she saw them. The serpents stirring in agitation, she retreated deeper into shadow, hoping they would pass, but fate had already guided their steps too close. One called her name aloud, mocking, daring her to appear. She did not wish to harm them. But when they stumbled into the cavern's mouth, torchlight quivering against the walls, her body betrayed her. The serpents hissed, lunging, and instinct forced her gaze upward. The first hunter's laughter froze mid-breath. His body stiffened, his torch clattered to the ground, sputtering as his skin paled into stone. The second cried out in terror, shielding his eyes, yet one accidental glance was enough. His shout turned to silence as rock sealed his throat. Medusa collapsed against the wall, trembling. The hunter's stone figures stood locked in the posture of their final moment, forever reminders of her curse. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to close eyes that had already done their damage. The serpents coiled around her arms protectively, but she could not bear their comfort. Her heart throbbed with despair. She had not chosen this, yet bloodless deaths followed wherever she went. She began to understand that her curse was not only exile, it was inevitability. Outside, storms gathered, unbidden. The sea heaved against the cliffs as if echoing her turmoil. Clouds knotted the sky, sealing her world into twilight even at midday. She felt both small and immense, as though her sorrow had become part of the weather itself. The world was beginning to know her not as a servant girl, not even as a wronged mortal, but as a force of nature, a danger written into the landscape. The villagers soon avoided the entire stretch of coast, marking it on their maps as cursed ground. Travellers circled wide around the hills. What had once been her prison was slowly becoming her domain, her name stretching like shadow over places she had never touched. She wandered the caverns and cliffs, hearing her serpents whisper, sensing her body aligning with this new identity. Yet inside her still burned the fragile ache of the girl who had once tended flowers, who had once been noticed not for dread, but for grace. At night she lay awake, listening to the waves pound the rocks. She wondered whether the gods still thought of her, whether Athena watched from her high throne, unmoved, or whether Poseidon remembered the devastation he had sown. Silence was the only answer, a silence that told her she was forgotten by heaven, abandoned to become whatever legend mortals shaped her into. That abandonment hardened something in her. If the gods would not claim her, she would claim herself, even if that self was called monster. Yet, despite her resolve, loneliness gnawed. She longed for a voice not silenced in stone, for a presence not driven by fear. She sometimes imagined speaking to the sea itself, confiding her sorrows into the foam, and in the rhythm of waves she almost believed it answered. It was in these conversations with tide and serpent, cave and shadow, that Medusa slowly began to reshape her grief into endurance. Her beauty was gone, but something else, vast and unyielding, was being born in its place. The wind carried whispers of new hunters preparing to seek her, emboldened by tales and blind to the warnings. She knew they would come, as surely as waves returned to the shore, and as she stood at the cave mouth, her serpents restless, her eyes dark with sorrow and fire, she wondered if the world was teaching her not only exile but also the art of survival. The horizon glowed with a dull, stormy red, as though destiny itself was walking nearer. The horizon's dull glow deepened as the days passed, and with it came rumours borne on wandering tongues. Medusa heard them drifting on the wind like dry leaves, kings offering rewards for her head, oracles speaking of her as trial and test, warriors sharpening blades against a fate they barely understood. Each story reached her before its tellers did, whispered by sea spray or echoed by her serpent's restless coils. She knew the hunters would come again, not merely for glory but because fear always tempts mortals into desperate conquest. The first to appear after the shepherds and hunters were three brothers from a distant island. They brought shields polished to mirror brightness, hoping to reflect her gaze back upon herself. Medusa watched from the shadows of her cave as they advanced with cautious steps, whispering prayers to every god they could name. She did not move until one of them raised his shield toward her, the mirrored surface catching the serpent's flickering tongues. The hiss that rose from her brow startled him, his hand trembling, and in that tremor fate closed its fist. His eyes lifted by mistake, and stone sealed his features into a grimace of awe and terror. The others faltered, their courage dissolving like salt in rain. One tried to flee, but fear twisted his feet into clumsiness. and before his body struck the ground, he too was rigid, pale, unmoving. The last brother dropped his shield, covering his eyes, but the sound of serpents slithering closer cracked his resolve. He dared a glance, and silence claimed him as well. Medusa leaned against the cavern wall, her heart aching with exhaustion. The brothers stood frozen at the threshold, guardians she had not chosen, statues testifying to her curse. She had taken no pleasure in their end. If anything, each death thickened her sorrow, layering guilt upon grief. Yet she could not change what she was. The gods had bound her fate, and mortals, stubborn in their pride, kept walking willingly into it. Over time her cave grew crowded with such figures, men locked in mid-stride, spears lifted forever, mouths open as if to release shouts that never came. The cavern became less a home than a gallery of warnings, each figure a reminder of humanity's refusal to heed fear. Medusa wept often in their presence, her tears tracing pale lines through the dust on her cheeks. Sometimes she begged their still faces for forgiveness, whispering apologies into their deaf ears. Yet stone does not answer, and silence remained her only reply. In her despair, she turned more often to the sea. She would stand at the cliff's edge, serpents coiling like restless tide, and pour her grief into the roar of waves. The sea listened, patient and immense. It did not soothe her, but it bore her sorrow into its endless body, spreading it across horizons she could not see. In that strange communion she felt less alone, as though the waters that had once delivered her ruin now carried her lament to distant shores. The world beyond her cliffs grew louder with her name. Some spoke it with trembling reverence, others spat it with contempt. Poets wove her story into cautionary verses, and sailors painted her likeness upon shields to frighten enemies. She had become more symbol than woman, more tale than truth. The girl who once arranged lilies was buried beneath the weight of myth. Yet within her chest, she still carried that girl's fragile heart, beating stubbornly, refusing to surrender entirely to the monster the world claimed she was. One night, under a moon heavy with silver, she dreamt again of Athena. The goddess stood before her, not in marble but in living flesh, her armor gleaming with a light that blinded. Athena's eyes were sharp as ever, unyielding, yet there was no hatred in them now, only inevitability. "You are a mirror," the goddess said in the dream, her voice the strike of flint and stone. "You reveal truth to those who gaze upon you. Their fear is their own undoing." Medusa reached to protest, to beg for release, but her lips froze as stone. She woke gasping, her serpents hissing in agitation, the dream's weight pressing heavily on her chest. She pondered the words for many days. Was she punishment alone, or had she been remade into something larger, an instrument of truth that mortals could not endure? The thought both horrified and steadied her. Perhaps her existence was not entirely without meaning. Perhaps her curse was not only her burden, but also a lesson the gods meant to etch into the bones of the world. Still, the loneliness remained. She roamed the caves at dusk, brushing her hands against cool stone, imagining voices where none lived. Sometimes she carved small patterns into the walls with broken shards of rock, spirals, flowers, the shapes of waves, tiny remnants of the girl who had once woven beauty into her days. The serpents watched, tilting their heads, their tongues flickering as though in sympathy. She began to see them less as tormentors, and more as companions, strange children born of her suffering, bound to her as tightly as breath. As autumn winds sharpened and the sea grew restless, Medusa felt the air shifting. Destiny was moving closer again, heavy with footsteps she could not yet hear. The hunters who had come before were mere ripples. Something greater loomed upon the horizon, a tide not of mortals alone but of stories converging. She could sense it in the way the serpents stirred, restless at night, their hisses carrying an urgency they had never held before. The cave walls seemed to hum with anticipation, as though they too knew that the next chapter of her fate would demand more than sorrow, more than survival. And so she waited, Poised between grief and defiance, her body both prison and weapon, her name already heavier than any mortal could bear. The horizon's glow deepened into a darker red, promising that the world's gaze would soon return to her with greater force than ever before. The horizon's darker red swelled into winter, and the sea thrashed with tempests that seemed to echo the unrest within her. Medusa no longer counted the days. Time was marked instead by the growth of salt crystals along the cave's edges, by the nests abandoned on the cliffs, by the endless hush of waves rehearsing their hymns below. In that suspended rhythm she felt her curse settle deeper, no longer a wound alone but a second skin. Mortals, despite their fear, could not resist approaching. Heroes in training sought her as a trial, eager to prove themselves against the terror spoken in every marketplace. Some came with offerings of iron nets, others with charms said to blind her gaze. None returned. Their bodies joined the silent congregation of stone in her cavern, an assembly of faces frozen in ambition and despair. Medusa walked among them like a reluctant Ristis presiding over a congregation she had never invited. She mourned each one, though her mourning no longer poured from her in sobs but in silence heavy as marble. Her serpents too had grown. Once no thicker than reeds, they now gleamed like polished bronze, their eyes glittering with a wisdom uncanny for creatures newly born. They swayed in unison when danger drew near, the hiss sharper, more insistent. Medusa began to understand them as extensions of her will, guardians that moved where her sorrow pointed. At night she lay in the dark cavern and felt their warmth coil around her neck, a crown she had not chosen but could no longer imagine being without. The world beyond her exile stirred with stories. Kings sent envoys to oracles, desperate to know whether her death or her endurance meant fortune for their reigns. Priests whispered that Athena's curse had not only punished but revealed, that Medusa was no longer mortal but something liminal, part of the border between gods and men. And while her name inspired dread, it also carried fascination. Some sculptors carved her likeness into shields, believing her image could protect armies. Others etched her face above city gates, hoping her petrifying gaze, even in effigy, would ward away evil. Medusa, alone in her cavern, knew nothing of these imitations, yet her curse was already spreading beyond her body, woven into the very fabric of human fear and hope. One twilight she wandered farther from her cave, climbing higher along the jagged cliffs where seabirds wailed. From that height she saw the world stretched wide, villages like tiny knots of firelight, the sea like an iron plate under the darkening sky. For a fleeting moment she felt the ache of beauty again, not of herself, but of the world she could no longer walk among. She remembered how it had felt to move unnoticed, to be part of that world rather than its terror. A tear slipped down her cheek, and when it struck the stone it glittered, hardening instantly into a shard of crystal. She picked it up in wonder, holding it in her palm. Perhaps her grief was reshaping itself into something the earth would keep. But peace never lingered long. That night, voices carried across the water, a band of sailors, reckless with wine, daring each other to seek the cave of the Gorgon. Their laughter reached her like knives. She stayed hidden, but their torches danced nearer until their shadows played along her walls. She heard them whispering, their courage faltering, their greed battling with fear. She felt the serpents stir, their hiss like wind across reeds. Medusa closed her eyes, praying they would retreat. Yet mortals rarely turn back when pride is at stake. When at last they stepped into the cavern's mouth, torchlight trembling, Medusa's body betrayed her again. The serpents rose, and her eyes, though squeezed shut, flared with their curse. She heard the sudden silence, the thud of torches falling, the breath cut short. When she opened her eyes, 3 more figures stood stiff as statues, their laughter arrested mid-echo. She slumped against the wall, drained, whispering apologies to men who could no longer hear. The cavern, once her refuge, now felt like a tomb expanding with every visit of the doomed. And yet something within her had shifted. The curse no longer felt entirely alien. She began to sense the outlines of power in it. a terrible gift woven into her tragedy. Though she loathed what it demanded, she could not deny the command it gave her over life and silence, over fear itself. It was a power mortals could not resist testing, and in their testing they only deepened her legend. She wondered if the gods had foreseen this, that her very suffering would make her unforgettable. On restless nights she dreamt of the temple once more, of lilies placed in bronze vases, of rose water dampening the air. But when she reached for that memory, the lilies withered, the water curdled, and Athena's statue glared through the ruin. Each dream ended with the goddess's eyes upon her, eyes that reflected not judgment alone, but a cold satisfaction. Medusa woke shivering, serpents restless, wondering if she was destined to remain the lesson carved into every fearful heart. The seasons turned, and with them the silence around her cave grew deeper. Villagers no longer dared approach even the outer paths. Hunters hesitated. Stillness cloaked the cliffs like a heavy garment. Medusa sat often at the cave's mouth, staring across the sea, wondering if any mortal would come not with spear or torch, but with compassion. Yet she knew such hope was dangerous as her gaze. Still the thought lingered, faint as the shimmer of stars beyond the storm clouds. The horizon darkened with promise again. This time it felt different, heavier, as though the threads of her fate were tightening into a knot. Something greater than hunters or sailors was stirring, drawn not only by fear of her but by the weaving of prophecy. Medusa sensed it in the sea's restless rhythm, in the serpent's agitation, in the hush that spread across the cliffs. A new visitor was coming, one who would not stumble in ignorance but arrive guided by destiny itself. The promise that pressed upon the horizon thickened into rumour, and rumour hardened into prophecy. Medusa felt it even before the voices of men confirmed it. The sea whispered of a hero destined to seek her, a youth touched by gods, armed not with ordinary steel but with the cunning of Olympus. Each night she dreamed of footsteps drawing nearer, steady as the tide, inevitable as dawn. She woke with her serpents restless, their tongues lashing the air as though they too tasted the approach of destiny. In distant halls, oracles spoke of her name with trembling lips. They said that only by facing the Gorgon could a certain hero prove himself worthy of future deeds. The name of Perseus began to thread itself into the air, drifting across markets and temples, carried by the fever of expectation. He was a youth of Argos, untried yet chosen, born into a net of prophecies that wound tighter with each retelling. The gods, who had cursed Medusa into exile, now prepared to use her once more, shaping her tragedy into a stepping stone for another's triumph. Medusa knew none of the details, yet she sensed their truth. She sat at the mouth of her cavern, watching the gulls wheel above the waves, and felt the old wound of abandonment pulse anew. Once she had been a girl whose beauty drew divine attention. Now she was a monster whose death would crown a hero. The gods had not finished with her, though they had never spoken comfort since her fall. She was a pawn still, though clad in serpents and sorrow. The realization made her heart both heavy and defiant. The cavern grew darker with omens. Strange winds swept through its passages, carrying scents of bronze and leather. In the still pools she saw flickers of a face not her own, young, determined, shadowed by divine favour. Her serpents hissed when these images surfaced, as if warning her of what she already knew. The statues of her victims stood mute around her, their silence a congregation awaiting the final sermon of her fate. She walked among them, touching their cold shoulders, whispering that perhaps they would soon have company unlike any they had known. Perseus's journey unfurled far away, yet its echoes reached her cave as though time itself bent to her curse. She dreamt of him visiting the grey sisters who shared one eye, their secrets trickling into his eager hands. She saw him in visions kneeling before Athena, the very goddess who had cursed her, and receiving a polished shield bright as moonlight upon still water. She shuddered when she glimpsed Hermes offering him a blade keen as truth, and the Hesperides yielding a sack woven to contain wonders and terrors alike. The visions left her gasping, the serpents writhing as if they too had seen. Yet with each dream she felt less a victim and more a participant. Her story was not ending. It was shifting. Though her death loomed, she sensed it would not erase her. The gods had etched her into the fabric of myth too deeply. Even in loss she would remain. Her image multiplied, her gaze borrowed by shields and temples, her name echoing in fear and fascination. A strange calm coiled beneath her grief. She would outlast even those who sought to end her. Still, fear did not vanish. She feared not for herself alone, but for what she had become. Would her end mean release, or would it cement forever the monstrous mask that had been forced upon her? She sat in the shadows, fingers tracing the rough grooves of the cavern wall, imagining her face carved there not by her own hand, but by history's relentless chisel. Perhaps beauty and terror had fused too tightly to ever be separated again. One night the sea grew eerily calm. No waves struck the cliffs. No wind stirred the branches. The silence was immense, filled only by the faint hiss of her serpents. She felt it then. The hero had set sail. The stillness of the water was not peace, but anticipation, as though the world itself held its breath for the meeting of two fates. Medusa lay awake until dawn, her heart drumming like war upon the stone floor. She did not pray. What prayer remained for one who had been abandoned by gods? Instead, she prepared in the only way she could, by accepting the inevitability. She walked the cavern slowly, touching the shoulders of each petrified figure, speaking to them as though they were companions. She told them of the dreams, of the youth called Perseus, of the weapons gleaming with divine blessing. Her voice was soft, soothing, as if rehearsing her farewell. The statues, mute and eternal, bore her words without judgment. When dawn came, a thin mist rolled across the cliffs, veiling the sea. Medusa stood at the cave's mouth, her veil pulled low, her serpents restless. She could not see the sails yet, but she knew they were there, cutting across the horizon with purpose. The mist parted briefly, and in that gap she thought she glimpsed a flash of bronze, a glimmer of shield light reflecting the first rays of sun. She stepped back into the cavern, her heart tightening, the weight of destiny pressing upon her shoulders. The sea exhaled, the mist closed, and silence returned. But it was no longer the silence of exile. It was the silence before an arrival, before a meeting that would carve itself into eternity. The silence before arrival stretched, taut as a bowstring. Medusa paced within the cavern, her serpents restless, their scales rasping softly against one another. Each hiss seemed to echo against the walls, a chorus of unease. The statues of those who had come before stood like frozen witnesses, their blind eyes turned toward her, their bodies poised forever in defiance. She felt surrounded not only by stone but by judgment, as if each figure asked whether she would yield to destiny or resist until the end. The mist outside thinned at last, and she felt the world exhale. A faint sound reached her, steady, deliberate, the measured steps of one who walked not in fear but in purpose. Perseus had come. She sensed him before she saw him, the aura of divine favor clinging to his movements, the glimmer of enchanted bronze brushing the walls as light bends around corners. Her serpents rose higher, tasting the air with nervous tongues. Medusa pressed her back against the stone, her heart steady yet sorrowful. She knew this was the hour written for her since the curse first coiled upon her brow. Perseus entered the cavern not with torchlight, but with a strange glow reflected from his shield. He did not look directly. He had been warned well. Instead, he moved with caution, eyes fixed on the polished bronze that mirrored her lair. Medusa saw his reflection before she saw him, a youth's face sharp with determination, lips tight with dread and resolve. She almost pitied him, for though he came as executioner, he too was bound by gods and prophecy. He was no freer than she. She stepped forward, serpents hissing, her form cast into the gleaming shield. For the first time she saw herself fully as the world now saw her, beauty twisted into horror, grace sharpened into menace, her heart wrenched. She was not the girl of lilies and rosewater any longer, but neither was she the monster his people whispered of. She was both, bound inseparably, a paradox no mortal could endure. The reflection hurt her more than his blade ever could. Perseus raised his sword, the edge catching what little light dared enter the cavern. Medusa's serpents lunged, striking at shadows, their fangs clashing against air. She did not move to strike him herself. Somewhere within her lingered a wish that he would falter, that compassion might root him to the spot, that the gods' plan might crumble in the face of human mercy. Yet she knew the gods do not weave mercy into their tapestries. They weave necessity, inevitability, and so the youth pressed forward, step by careful step, never meeting her eyes, only her mirrored ghost. She could have fled deeper into the cave, but she did not. A strange calm descended, heavy and still. Perhaps she was weary of exile, of sorrow, of endless misunderstanding. Perhaps she longed for release, or perhaps in the secret chamber of her heart, she knew that in death she would not vanish, but endure, her story carried by tongues and stones long after her body fell. The serpents shrieked as though they sensed her resignation. Their coils frantic, she touched them briefly, whispering without words, and for a moment they softened, their hiss lowering into a mournful sigh. Then came the stroke. Perseus, guided by the shield's reflection, swung with precision. The blade cut through air, through scales, through silence. Pain flared, sharp and final. But it was not pain alone. It was release. Medusa gasped, her body folding, the serpents writhing violently before falling still. The cavern trembled, as though the earth itself mourned the severing of her fate. Her head, crowned in living serpents, fell into the waiting sack, its power undimmed even in death. Perseus did not pause to look. He dared not. He tied the bag swiftly, the weight of his triumph heavy not only on his shoulder, but upon the future. He stepped back from the body, shield gleaming, sword dripping with the silence of endings. The statues around them remained unmoved, yet in their stillness they seemed to bear witness, their stone lips pressed into unspoken lament. For Medusa, there was no more exile, no more cave, no more grief of solitude. Yet something lingered beyond her body, a presence that would not dissolve. She felt herself stretched into myth, into memory, her story now detached from flesh and carried into eternity. She was no longer a woman, no longer even a monster. She was symbol of fear, of warning, of beauty transformed and weaponized. The gods had taken her life, but they could not take her permanence. Perseus turned and left the cavern, the sack swinging heavily at his side. Outside, the sea roared again, as though acknowledging the deed. Clouds parted, a cold light breaking through, and the cliffs seemed taller, sharper, their shadows lengthened by the burden he carried. The cave, now silent, held only her body and the stone congregation of those who had come before. But in that silence, an echo stirred. Medusa's presence had not ended. It had only changed shape. Her power would live on in the head that Perseus bore, in the fear that would ripple across lands, in the shield that would one day blaze with her likeness. She had fallen, yes, but the story of her fall had just begun to carve itself into eternity. And as the sea swallowed the horizon behind Perseus, the air seemed to whisper with serpents unseen, promising that Medusa's shadow would follow him and all who came after, long beyond this single ending. The whisper of serpents clung to Perseus as he descended the cliffs, the sack heavy at his side. The sea air, usually clean and sharp, felt thick with unseen coils. Each wave that broke seemed to hiss. Each gust of wind carried an echo of her presence. Though her body lay abandoned in the cavern, Medusa was not gone. Her essence moved with him, stretched into the space between life and legend. The gods had not fashioned her to fade. A Athena herself guided the youth's hand. Yet even in her victory, the goddess did not erase Medusa. Instead, she ensured the Gorgon's power endured, bound now to the severed head, nestled in Perseus's satchel. Within that darkness, the serpents still writhed, their scales rustling faintly, their tongues flickering with venomous memory. The eyes, though unseen, held their dread potency. Whoever dared a glance would still meet the cold embrace of stone. Perseus felt it. The weight not only of a trophy, but of a curse. He did not dare open the sack, though curiosity gnawed at him. At night, as he rested beneath strange stars, he heard faint hisses, like whispers testing the seams of the bag. He would pull it tighter, muttering prayers to Athena, who had granted him both protection and burden. Yet even he, chosen and shielded, knew he carried more than victory. He carried the haunting of a wronged woman remade into weapon. From her new state, Medusa felt herself differently. No longer bound by body, she floated like thought, like storm, like omen. She did not rest. Though death had claimed her form, she watched through the sack's weave, her gaze still lethal, though hidden. She could sense the youth's fear, his awe, his resolve. He was no enemy to her, not truly only the hand through which the gods had written their lesson. Her sorrow no longer boiled in grief alone. It spread outward, a river seeking every channel. She was not finished, though flesh had ended. She was becoming myth fully now, etched not into marble but into memory. When Perseus reached the edge of the world, he faced new trials. The sisters of Medusa, Stheno and Euryale, screamed into the night when they discovered her body lifeless. Their cries shook the mountains, tore through valleys, rattled the sky with grief. They had been monstrous long before Medusa's fall, but their anguish was raw, ancient, unstoppable. They hunted the youth, their wings beating storms into the air, their voices curses turned to sound. Perseus fled, guided by Hermes' swiftness, shield raised, sack clutched tight. Yet even as he escaped, the cries of Medusa's sisters followed him, a lament for blood shared and beauty broken. And Medusa heard them. Though she no longer shared their form, their grief reached her. Sharp as stone, cutting skin, she wanted to answer, to cry out with them, to say she had not sought this fate, that her curse had been punishment for another's trespass, but her voice was bound to silence, her protest sealed behind divine decree. All she could send them was the restless hiss of serpents twisting in the dark, a chorus they alone might hear carried upon the wind. Her name spread even faster now. Perseus, youth turned hero, sailed from island to island, carrying the sack as proof of his conquest. In each port whispers grew louder. The Gorgon was slain, yet with every telling, her terror deepened, not diminished. Mothers still hushed children with her name. Warriors still painted her face upon their shields. Temples began to carve her likeness above their gates, believing that the image of her dread could ward off all evil. Even in death, she was not undone. She was multiplied, her gaze cast across stone and bronze, her serpents etched into memory. Medusa felt the strange paradox of her fate. Her body had been silenced, yet her presence was louder than ever. Her beauty, once fragile, had been twisted into weapon, and now that weapon was eternal. She was feared, yes, but she was also necessary. People who had once shunned her now sought her image to guard them. They revered what they had condemned. This irony weighed upon her spirit, heavy as the stone she had unwillingly gifted to others. Perseus, meanwhile, bore the cost of carrying her. He could not sleep easily, for in dreams he saw her face reflected in the shield, not monstrous but mournful, her eyes filled not with rage but with sorrow. He would wake shivering, wondering if victory had ever truly belonged to him. For though he had slain her, he had also unleashed her shadow upon the world, a shadow that would cling to his name as tightly as hers. Medusa's journey was no longer one of flesh and exile, but of legacy. She had been beauty transformed into terror, terror transformed into power, and now power transformed into permanence. She could not undo what had been done, but she could endure in this new form, woven into shields, into gates, into the very breath of myth. The gods had used her as lesson, yet in doing so they had ensured she would outlast them in the hearts of mortals. The sea continued its endless hymn, the cliff stood unchanged, and the cavern that had been her refuge remained filled with statues of those who had crossed her gaze. But Medusa was no longer bound there. She travelled now in Perseus's shadow, in whispers of serpents, in the fearful awe that spread from tongue to tongue. And though her head swung in the sack at the hero's side, her spirit knew this was not the end. This was the widening of her presence, the unfolding of her destiny beyond the narrow edges of her exile. And somewhere ahead, destiny promised more still. A queen, a tyrant, a kingdom trembling, all waiting for the moment when her severed gaze would alter the course of mortals once again. The sea widened beneath Perseus's ship, and with every mile her presence reached farther, though her body was gone. The sack swayed like a pendulum, and within it the serpents stirred, restless, alive. Their hiss was faint but insistent, like reeds bending in a hidden marsh, like wind whispering secrets in a language the living could almost hear. Medusa was no longer confined to cavern or cliff. She drifted wherever the sack swung, wherever the hero's footsteps pressed upon earth. In death her reach expanded. Perseus did not speak of it, but his crew noticed. At night their eyes darted to the bag. Their voices hushed when it moved, as though something within still breathed. They whispered that the Gorgon spirit lingered, that no blade could sever her completely from the world. Some crossed themselves in ritual gestures, others offered libations into the waves. They feared her, but in their fear they kept her name alive. Each murmur ensured that Medusa endured, not only as memory but as force. She felt their fear, tasted it like salt on her lips. It was bitter, but it nourished her. Once she had lived on hope and duty, tending temples with gentle hands. Now she was fed by fear, transformed into something that required no shrine, no offering. The dread she inspired was its own altar, one that needed no walls of marble. She wondered if Athena had foreseen this paradox, that in punishing her the goddess had given her immortality not of body, but of presence. Their voyage carried them to lands of iron and dust, where kings raised high towers and ruled with hard hands. Among them was Polydectes, who had long desired to claim Perseus's mother and prove his own dominion. To him Perseus brought the sack, heavy with fate. Medusa sensed the tension before she saw it, the greed of the king, the pride of a man who thought no god could deny him. When Perseus unveiled the head, even bound in death her eyes flared, piercing the chamber. Polydectes stiffened mid-breath, his sneer frozen, his flesh turning pale as marble. One by one his courtiers followed, their limbs locked, their mouths silenced. The hall, once clamorous with boast and flattery, grew still as a mausoleum. Medusa's gaze, though severed from her, still flowed like a river, unstoppable. In that moment she was no longer only a curse, but a weapon wielded by fate to tear down arrogance. Though she had not chosen it, she was the hand of justice, even if delivered by another's grip. She lingered in the silence that followed. The hall of the king became her new cavern, filled not with hunters or shepherds, but with rulers caught in their own ambition. Their frozen eyes stared blankly into eternity, unaware that they were bound by the gaze of one they had never met. Medusa's sorrow swelled. These men had not wronged her, yet their pride had summoned their end. She had been made to punish indiscriminately, a tool that did not weigh innocence against guilt, and yet, deep within her, she wondered if perhaps the world needed such reminders, that even kings could crumble to dust when beauty was scorned, when sacred vows were broken, when pride grew louder than humility. Perseus lowered the sack again, and the air released its tension. He turned to the statues, his jaw tight, uncertain whether he had delivered salvation or ruin. He could not deny his success, yet victory carried the taste of ashes. The head in his hand had ended tyranny, but it had also spread silence where once voices lived. He glanced toward the bag, half in awe, half in dread, as though speaking to it might awaken a reply, but the only sound was the faint hiss of serpents, echoing like memory. Medusa drifted within, her essence neither at rest nor in torment, but in strange suspension. She had become both curse and blessing, feared and sought, condemned and revered. She had been stripped of choice, yet choice no longer mattered. Her role was larger than her will, her story larger than her sorrow. She was the inevitability that followed arrogance, the shadow trailing pride. Her name travelled farther than Perseus himself. Travellers who had never glimpsed her cave spoke of her now as if they had stood before her. Merchants carried her likeness carved into amulets, believing her image could ward away thieves. Mothers who once hushed children with warnings of her hiss now hung her face above their doors, convinced it would frighten away spirits of illness. Medusa, who had been cast out as impure, who had been remade into terror, was now invoked as protector. The irony curved like a blade back upon itself, cutting her sorrow anew. Yet she accepted it with a weary grace. If the world would not remember her innocence, it would at least carry her power. Better to be feared and respected than erased and forgotten. In this truth she found a strange peace. Fragile as it was, her legacy had already escaped her body. It would outlive Perseus, outlive kings, perhaps even outlive the gods who had cursed her. As Perseus sailed onward, the head heavy in its bag, Medusa's presence stretched still farther. She could sense new lands waiting, new eyes to be turned to stone, new myths to weave her into their walls. The sea rolled beneath them, patient and endless, as though it too bore her with reverence. Above, the stars glimmered coldly, watching a story they themselves would one day carry in constellations. And somewhere in that glimmering silence, Medusa felt destiny stirring again. Her tale was not finished in the Hall of Kings, nor upon Perseus's ship. Greater battles awaited, greater transformations of her legacy. The serpents hissed softly, as if agreeing, their sound a lullaby and a warning both. The serpents stirred faintly within the sack. As Perseus pressed onward, their hiss no louder than a sigh, yet insistent enough to unsettle the air. Medusa's presence lingered, not bound by death, but stretched thin, threaded into each moment of the journey. She was not silent within herself. She felt the tremor of oars biting into water, the anxious breath of sailors, the unsteady heartbeat of a hero who carried both glory and dread upon his shoulders. Her essence rode with him, unseen yet inescapable, as though her exile had shifted from cave to world entire. The hero's voyage carried him to the edge of another fate, for a maiden's cries rode the salt wind long before her form was seen. Andromeda, chained to the jagged rocks by decree of her own people, awaited a sea beast that would claim her as sacrifice. The ocean foamed at her feet, waves gnashing like jaws. Perseus beheld her with the urgency of a man who had been born into prophecy, every step echoing with divine orchestration. Yet, though he drew his sword and raised his shield, it was Medusa's severed gaze, hidden in the sack, that tilted destiny's scales. From her liminal state, Medusa felt the maiden's fear, sharp and pure, and it pierced her like a memory of her own younger self, innocent, unguarded, unaware of the storm that waited to shatter her life. She ached with recognition. Once she had been the girl destined for sanctity, chosen by duty, unprepared for violation. Now she was the weapon poised to decide another girl's fate. The irony was cruel, yet it bound them in kinship across circumstance. The sea beast rose, its body vast as a cliff face, its roar shaking foam into the sky. Perseus acted swiftly, but he knew steel alone would not fell such a creature. He untied the sack and held it aloft, never daring to look within. The head, though severed, awoke as if eager, serpents writhing to taste the salt air once more. Medusa's eyes, closed in death yet eternally open in power, blazed with their petrifying truth. The monster's roar choked into silence, its muscles stiffened, its vast body calcified into rock. The waves struck against its rigid flanks, but the beast was no longer sea and sinew. It was sculpture, monument, warning. Andromeda's chains rattled against the stone as she turned her face away, spared by Perseus's careful shielding. The people on the cliffs cried out, their voices rising in astonishment and relief. They praised the hero, his cleverness, his favor with gods, but Medusa, within the silence of her new being, knew the truth. It was her gaze, stolen and wielded, that had saved the maiden. She, the cursed, the exiled, the condemned, had once again shaped the world beyond her cave. Perseus lowered the sack, binding it tightly, hiding her away once more. His triumph was celebrated, his name swelling into song, yet it was Medusa's severed head that had conquered the unconquerable. In the shadows of her suspended spirit, she reflected bitterly on this truth. Her beauty had been punished, her sorrow ignored, her curse feared. Yet in death her terror was hailed as salvation, when bent to another's will. Was this her fate, to be useful only as weapon, never honoured for what she had been? And yet, as she considered the maiden's trembling relief, the way chains fell useless into foam, Medusa felt a flicker of something that resembled solace. Perhaps her fate was twisted beyond recognition, but at least some fragment of her power had spared another woman the weight of unjust sacrifice. It was not redemption, but it was something. Even in death she could still alter the course of injustice, if only indirectly. The sea winds carried the sounds of rejoicing, but Medusa heard within them another current, deeper and more somber. The gods had woven her into their tapestry not to honour her, but to use her, and yet in that weaving she had become indispensable, her essence bound into every heroic tale, every shield lifted against shadow. She was no longer the girl with lilies, nor even the monster in her cave. She was eternal now, inseparable from the very fabric of legend. Perseus and Andromeda departed the cliffs together, leaving behind the stone beast, its shape forever a testament to Medusa's gaze. The villagers would tell the tale for generations, praising the hero who had slain the Gorgon and used her dread to conquer the sea's hunger. Few, if any, would mourn the woman behind the head, the innocence broken in Athena's temple. Yet Medusa endured in silence, her sorrow now indistinguishable from her power. Night fell, stars scattering across the sky like salt on black stone. Perseus rested beside the maiden he had saved, but the sack remained close to his side, a shadow he could neither embrace nor cast away. Within it, Medusa's presence stirred, quieter now, yet steady as a heartbeat. She had not chosen this role, yet she had shaped the world once again, her transformation rippling outward, like tide against cliffs. And as the stars burned above, Medusa wondered if perhaps her journey was not merely one of punishment, but of passage towards something vaster, darker, and more enduring than even the gods who had cursed her. The stars wheeled in silence above, and though Perseus slept at last beside the freed maiden, the sack never stilled. Within it the serpents shifted faintly, their scales rusping like reeds in midnight wind. Medusa's presence lingered as steady as the tide, watching from her severed form, listening to the soft rhythm of waves against the shore. She could not close her eyes, her curse made her gaze eternal, even when bound. Yet in that sleeplessness she saw everything: the hero's unease, the maiden's fragile breaths, the shadows of gods moving invisibly around them. From her strange threshold between life and legend, she felt the pull of threads stretching beyond the shore. She sensed a banquet hall awaiting her, a place where kings gathered in pride, where triumphs were demanded and proven through spectacle. Polydectes, already frozen in her gaze, was not the last ruler whose fate would intertwine with hers. The gods had bound her to destiny's loom, and she could see now how wide her shadow would spread. For Perseus, dawn came with restless urgency. He rose, tightened the sack, and guided Andromeda toward her people, her chains now nothing but memory. The crowd hailed him with reverence, lifting his name higher, but always their eyes lingered on the bag he bore. They could not see its contents, but they felt it, a presence that pressed upon their chests like the weight of stone. Even in concealment, Medusa's gaze changed the air. Her very silence commanded reverence, though it was mistaken as fear of the hero. As Andromeda walked free among them, her beauty radiant in the new sun, Medusa felt an ache stir deep within her essence. Once she too had been gazed upon with awe, her beauty whispered about with reverence and caution. Now that memory seemed distant, blurred as though belonging to another life. She was no longer beauty but terror, no longer maiden but warning. Yet she felt a kinship with the girl, for both had been bound unjustly, chained by powers greater than themselves. The difference was cruel. Andromeda's chains had broken, while Medusa's had only multiplied. The journey pressed onward. Each step away from the sea seemed to tighten the threads of fate. Perseus carried her not merely as weapon but as proof, as legacy, as key to doors yet unopened. He travelled through villages and valleys, and in each place her name preceded him. People whispered of the severed head, of eyes that froze stone, of serpents that hissed even after death. The further he walked, the more her myth swelled, until she felt herself woven into the very breath of the land. Her sisters still cried in the distance. Stena and Uriel, bound to her by blood and by monstrous fate, mourned in shrieks that rattled sky and earth. Their grief carried across seas, and Medusa, though beyond mortal ears, heard them. She longed to answer, to tell them she had not abandoned them willingly, that her fall had been carved by divine hands. Yet the sack was silence, her mouth closed by death, her voice smothered beneath the weight of myth. Only the serpents hissed, and perhaps in their restless coils her sisters could still feel her, if only faintly, like the ghost of touch across an infinite distance. As Perseus neared his homeland, the tension thickened. His heart was buoyed by triumph, yet it bore unease, for he knew what awaited him. The hall of his king was no sanctuary but a snare of arrogance. Polydectes had mocked him, demanded proof, set him upon an impossible quest. Now Perseus returned with proof beyond imagining. The gods had sharpened Medusa into the very blade that would sever pride from throne. Medusa, within the sack, felt the looming of that hall. She sensed the weight of stone walls, the echo of voices proud and careless, the hunger for spectacle. She would be revealed again, her gaze no longer curse in exile, but judgment in public. The thought ached within her. She had never sought to be a weapon, never longed to be the end of men. Yet the gods had written her fate not in ink, but in venom, and she could not choose otherwise. Perseus entered the hall, greeted with sneers and disbelief. The courtiers leaned forward, eager to mock, to scorn, to tear down the youth they had deemed unworthy. The king reclined, arrogance gleaming in his eyes, certain that no boy could return from such a task. Medusa felt their scorn like heat through the sack, the weight of 1,000 careless judgments pressing upon her. She had borne such gazes before, once as admiration, once as condemnation. Now they would meet her eyes in their final form. The hero untied the sack with deliberate care, his shield raised, his gaze averted. The serpents hissed, writhing as though they knew the moment had come. Medusa's eyes, though severed, flared once more, their power undimmed. The hall froze. Polydectes, mid-smile, stiffened into silence, his arrogance etched forever into stone. Courtiers followed, their laughter severed, their gestures suspended, their pride immortalized in marble mockery. The chamber fell still, filled with statues where men had stood. In death, Medusa's gaze had delivered what the living woman never could. Justice swift and absolute, Unbent by plea or power, Perseus lowered the head, veiling it again, but the silence lingered, heavy as a tomb, and within that silence, Medusa felt herself stretch further into eternity. Her beauty had once drawn gods to folly, her curse had turned mortals to stone, and now her severed head had toppled kings. She was no longer bound to her cave, no longer confined to sorrow. She had become something vaster, a force, a presence, a truth that neither blade nor exile could extinguish. The hall echoed with nothing but the soft hiss of serpents, as if whispering that destiny had only just begun to unfold. The silence of the king's hall lingered long after stone replaced breath. Where pride and derision had once filled the air, there was only stillness now, each figure frozen mid-sneer, mid-jeer, mid-grin. The serpents coiled gently against Medusa's severed brow, their tongues flickering as though savouring the justice that had been carried out. Though her body was gone, her essence remained awake within the gaze. She felt the echo of every eye that had met hers, their arrogance carved into permanence by her curse. Perseus stood amid the statues, his chest rising and falling with a mix of relief and unease. He had conquered kings and monsters alike, yet his greatest power was not truly his. The bag at his side bore more than a trophy. It bore a presence too vast for him to comprehend. He was hailed as hero, but he knew that the Gorgon's shadow stretched over him, guiding his every triumph. Medusa felt this too. Though she could not speak, she sensed his thoughts, the tremor of his uncertainty. He had wielded her curse against tyrants, against beasts, against all that stood in his path. But each time he touched the sack, a shiver ran through him, a reminder that his victories depended on the silence of a woman wronged, a beauty punished. She almost pitied him, caught in the net of gods just as she had been. They were both prisoners, though bound in different chains. Word of the hall's petrification spread quickly. Travellers spoke of a court turned to statues, a king silenced forever by the head of the Gorgon. Villagers whispered in awe, and sculptors carried the tale into their work, chiseling her likeness into stone with reverence and fear. The more people feared her, the stronger her presence grew. She was no longer a shadow on the cliffs, but a figure etched into the imagination of nations. Her curse had been transformed into symbol, and symbols do not die. Yet, within the sack, Medusa's spirit remained restless. She had become judge and executioner without choice. Each time her gaze was unveiled, lives ended, and though some were cruel men who deserved the silence they met, others were caught in its sweep by chance. She had no hand in choosing, and that powerlessness echoed the same wound that had begun her transformation. What was she now but a vessel of unyielding fate, her humanity erased in the service of divine order? The gods watched from afar, their silence heavy. Athena, whose temple had been violated, gazed down with satisfaction. The curse she had laid upon Medusa had ripened into a weapon that served her will, striking down pride and hubris through mortal hands. Yet beneath that divine satisfaction, Medusa felt another current, the faintest envy perhaps or recognition. Athena, born of wisdom and war, saw herself reflected in this mortal-turned monster, a mirror she could neither embrace nor shatter. Perseus continued his journey, the sack heavy at his side, Andromeda at his hand. Their path wound through mountains and valleys, each step carrying the Gorgon's presence farther from the cliffs where she had once dwelled. Medusa's sorrow stretched with them, spilling across the land like a veil of mist. She was carried into realms she had never walked, yet her essence left an imprint, her story settling into every hearth where her name was spoken. At night, Perseus dreamed uneasily. In the flicker of firelight, he saw Medusa, not as head severed, but as woman standing whole, her eyes filled with grief, her serpents quiet, her hands open as though pleading. He would wake with sweat on his brow, clutching the sack tighter, whispering Athena's name for courage. But the image of her sorrow lingered. Perhaps he, more than any other, began to sense the depth of her tragedy, the cost behind the weapon he bore. And Medusa, though she could not reach him, felt a strange kinship with his dreams. At least there, in the space between sleep and waking, she was seen not only as monster, but as woman. It was a fleeting recognition, fragile as morning dew, but it soothed her restless essence. If even one mortal could glimpse the truth beneath her curse, perhaps her story was not entirely lost to distortion. Their journey pressed toward new lands, where foreign kings raised altars to strange gods, where seas broke upon unfamiliar shores. Yet always the sack remained near, its presence a constant hum. Medusa sensed the threads of destiny tightening again, drawing her toward new reckonings. She did not know what form they would take, but she felt the serpents stir, their hiss low and steady, as if they too awaited the unfolding. The stars burned above, impassive, and the earth turned, carrying them onward. Medusa's tale had not ended with her death. It had only grown. Her beauty had been her downfall, her curse her exile, her death her release. But now her legacy was becoming something greater, something beyond her control. She was a force carved into the marrow of myth, shaping lives long after her own had been severed. And as Perseus walked beneath the darkening sky, unaware of how far her story would reach, Medusa's spirit coiled within the sack, waiting. The world was not finished with her yet. The world was not finished with her yet. It turned another page, drawing ink from salt and rumour, from the hush before new thunder. The sack rode against the hero's hip, a pendulum of fate. Within it, her serpents tested the weave, and her sleepless eyes, hidden, remained the still centre of a widening circle. Night breathed slow, as if counting destinies. Far behind where her body had fallen, drops of blood took root in stone and foam. From the bright spill that kissed the earth rose Pegasus, hooves clean as moonlight. From the darker pool rose Chrysaor, carrying the first edge of morning. Medusa felt them without eyes. As a house feels a door open, tenderness returned for a breath. Something had been born of her after ruin. The sea kept a keepsake. When Perseus, weary of flight and praise, set the head upon wet weed, her glance hardened fronds into coral. Fishermen later held those branches, red as coals, and wondered what storm had sculpted them. She who could not enter markets now lived in bracelets and thresholds. Westward the youth travelled beneath a widening sky until he reached the orchard of Atlas, old as horizons and heavy with a promise. Fearing theft of gold, the giant denied him shelter. Perseus answered with her silence. The sack unlidded. Her unseen gaze brushed the Titan like winter. Atlas stiffened. Shoulders rose into ranges. Tendons cooled into valleys. Snow would name him. Medusa felt the ache of it. Her curse could turn even patience into stone and story. From that same fatal mercy, other paradoxes bloomed. Athena, guardian of cities, gathered drops of Gorgon blood, separating left from right as carefully as a surgeon parts night from dawn. One vial killed without noise. The other recalled the lost, returning breath from embers. She entrusted both to Asclepius, who learned that every cure is a blade with two edges. Thus Medusa's undoing entered medicine. Life braided to death like the twin forks of a serpent's tongue. Meanwhile the sack grew heavier. Praise rang after Perseus. Like coins, yet he walked beneath a shadow he could feel. Each time he unbound the mouth, the world revised itself. Each time he bound it again, the world kept the revision. At last, he climbed the steps of the city of wisdom. Athena awaited beneath a sky polished to a mirror's calm. She wore no smile. Olive and iron hung in the air. Perseus knelt and raised the burden. The goddess took it with hands that never trembled. Medusa felt the shock of that touch, the mind that had remade her, the mercy that would not bloom. And then a stillness like winter sunlight. No word passed between them, save the agreement of function. Athena set the head upon her aegis, the dread skin that remembered thunder. There the serpents braided into emblem and edge. From the aegis her gaze would flare on battlefields, arresting armies, curdling boasts, sheltering what wisdom had built. No longer a cave's rumor or a king's private doom, she became civic weather, a public caution, a bright terror yoked to order. Did the goddess feel pity then? If so, it was the austere pity of architects. The sorrow that knows a crack cannot remain inside a temple. Medusa read no tenderness in that calm. What she felt was clarity, cold as spring water. The goddess had taken her from the solitude of grief and installed her inside the machinery of law. It was not forgiveness, it was placement. And still her story spread sideways. Children pointed at doors carved with her rings of hair. Sailors nailed her face to prows and cut through storms. Smiths hammered her into crest and coin. Wherever a glance might turn the heart from folly, artisans borrowed her. Beauty that once drew ruin had been recast as a warning that kept ruin at bay. Night fell, and the aegis held a radiance like a coal thinking. From its curve she looked upon streets and upon years assembling like a procession. She sensed wars yet unkindled pausing at the sight of her. Rulers lowering the volume of their pride, supplicants clutching amulets that repeated her frown. Far away, across unbuilt harbours and unborn tongues, she felt the press of epochs. The world set her on its brow, the brow learned to furrow. Yet, within the emblem a small ache persisted, a memory leaf that refused to fall. She remembered rosewater and lilies, the mirror that took too long to answer. The high priestess whispering to stone as if to a listener. The ache did not want the old life back. It wanted only to be witnessed. Perhaps that is what every monster requests at the end of its making. Not absolution, but accuracy. The wind turned. A trumpet far below shook a thread of dusk. On the aegis the serpents settled their chins like sentries closing their eyes. In the deep of her, Medusa gathered herself into quiet, ready to serve the city whose guardian had unmade her. Beyond the walls, a traveller lifted a shield stamped with her image, and a child traced its lines without knowing the word for the feeling it stirred. Only the fence that some doors should open slowly. The world was not finished with her yet, but for a breath it held her where she was, no longer fleeing, no longer hunted, no longer merely a story told to frighten. She was harnessed light, the stillness before a rash word, the weight that makes a boast reconsider. And somewhere west of wisdom and east of regret, a winged horse struck the air and rose, scattering a rain of salt that flashed like broken mirrors before it learned to become stars. Upon Athena's aegis she now lay, fixed in golden shadow, her serpents curled into eternity. The goddess bore her on battlefields, and men who once scorned her name trembled at her likeness. The clang of bronze, the thunder of hooves, the roar of armies, all bent when the shield flashed. Even unseen, Medusa's gaze was felt, a weight upon courage, a hand upon pride. She was no longer a woman, no longer even a severed head. She was dread distilled, emblem and omen, living within war's rhythm. And yet within that stillness she remained conscious, aware in the way roots are aware of rain. She felt each clash, each cry, each moment when an enemy faltered at the sight of her. She heard the prayers of soldiers who touched her likeness for protection, their voices mingling with the shrieks of those who cursed her as demon. Both prayers and curses were the same, acknowledgments of her power. Through them she endured. But Medusa was more than an emblem. Though she no longer walked cliffs or caverns, fragments of her essence continued to bleed into the world. Each drop of blood spilt from her severing had sown something lasting. Pegasus, rising like dawn, and Chrysol, solid as twilight. They were her children, born of ruin, carrying her legacy, not in stone but in flight and flesh. She felt them distantly, the way a mother might feel the tide within her womb. They were reminders that beauty turned to terror could still yield creation, that even destruction gave birth to wonder. The irony did not escape her. Once she had dreamed of bearing gentle offerings into Athena's temple, of being vessel for sanctity. Now her body had borne a winged horse and a warrior, Creatures destined to stride into the myths of men. She wondered if they knew whose blood had shaped them, if they sensed the sorrow braided into their birth. Pegasus, galloping upon clouds, surely carried some echo of her longing for freedom, for skies beyond exile. And Chrysaor, steady and sharp, must have inherited her quiet defiance, the will that had kept her heart beating in the cave's darkness. The world, however, remembered her differently. Temples began to carve her face into lintels and keystones, her serpents curling into protective spirals. Merchants carried amulets stamped with her likeness across seas, swearing that her gaze kept thieves away. Mothers hung her effigy above cradles to ward off spirits of illness. She who had been shunned and cast out now became guardian, her curse transfigured into shield, in every doorway marked with her eyes. Medusa endured, not as maiden, not as monster, but as protector against the very fears she embodied. This duality ached within her spirit. She was at once feared and revered, condemned and cherished, weapon and sanctuary. She longed for someone to remember her as she had truly been, a girl with hands perfumed in rose water, arranging lilies beneath marble pillars. Yet that memory drifted like smoke in the winds of time. The world had no place for her innocence. It carried only her terror, repurposed into safety. Beauty had been stolen from her, yet in its theft she had become eternal. Athena knew this. The goddess bore her likeness without remorse, as if to say that Medusa's story was complete, her suffering not wasted, but transformed into divine utility. But Medusa's spirit did not agree. She felt herself unfinished, her tale still unfolding. She was not merely a tool of the gods, nor a relic of vengeance. She was a wound carved into myth, a question whispered through ages. What becomes of beauty when it is punished, when it is twisted into dread? The question rippled outward, stirring poets who dared to wonder, sculptors who dared to soften her face in marble rather than hardnet. Some painted her not with fangs and rage, but with sorrow. Her serpents laid gentle upon her shoulders, her eyes cast down as though tired of their burden. These rare visions brushed against the truth of her heart, glimpses of the woman beneath the monster. Medusa felt these attempts like cool water across flame, brief but healing. In them she was remembered not as curse, but as victim, as survivor, as something more complex than fear. Yet the gods would not let her fade into tenderness. They ensured her dread remained sharp, preserved her horror so it could strike awe across centuries. Each time the aegis flashed in battle, she felt herself wielded not as woman but as storm. Each time an enemy faltered, she remembered the shepherd boy, the hunters, the sailors turned to stone. Each time her power was used, she asked silently whether any of it had meaning, or whether she was only endless punishment turned outward. Night after night, while armies slept and cities quieted, she remained awake upon the aegis, her serpents whispering against bronze. In their hiss she heard not menace but lullabies, echoes of companionship from her exile. They comforted her still, even in death, as if reminding her that she had never been wholly alone. Through them she remembered that she had been more than her curse. The winds of destiny turned again, subtle but sure. Medusa sensed it not in the clamour of war, but in the hush between seasons. Her story was not finished, not while her likeness guarded doors and her children roamed skies. Something deeper awaited, a legacy beyond vengeance, a truth beyond symbol. And as the moon cast silver across Athena's shield, she braced herself, certain that her transformation was still unfolding. The moon's silver slowly withdrew, and dawn spread its pale fingers across the shield where Medusa's likeness gleamed. Cities stirred awake beneath Athena's watch. Soldiers polished bronze, merchants opened gates adorned with her face, and mothers whispered her name as spell against misfortune. Medusa's story had rippled outward, like a stone cast into still water, its circles ever widening. She was everywhere now, her image stamped upon clay and coin. carved into lintels, painted on amphorae. She had become both boundary and protection, the line where men hesitated before arrogance. From within this strange endurance, Medusa felt the paradox of her being sharpened. She who had once begged for anonymity in the temple's shadow was now omnipresent. She who had been punished for beauty now served as beauty's guardian. Every shield that bore her face turned away danger. Every doorway crowned with her serpents dared evil to enter. And yet she was not remembered as maiden or victim, only as monster, her suffering rewritten into menace. Her humanity, so fragile, remained veiled behind coils of myth. Yet, myth has a way of preserving fragments, even against itself. Poets sang of her with venom, but some voices softened their verses, imagining her not with fangs bared, but eyes downcast. Sorrow heavy as stone, sculptors too, carved her not only in fury but in mourning. Her lips parted as if to sigh. Medusa felt these attempts like faint touch upon her spirit, as though the world itself sought to reconcile her two halves, woman and monster, beauty and terror. They were imperfect reflections, but in them she was seen, if only briefly. Her children carried her legacy further. Pegasus, winged and unbound, became the mount of muses and heroes, his hooves striking springs from earth, fountains where poets would drink inspiration. Chrysaor, solid and fierce, walked another path, bearing the weight of his strange birth. They bore within them the contradictions of their mother, creatures of beauty and strength, born from blood and grief. Medusa felt them distantly. Threads of herself stretched across sky and soil. In their existence she found solace. Though she had been reduced to emblem, her essence still lived in beings of freedom and might. The gods themselves continued to wield her with indifference. Athena displayed her head upon the aegis without remorse, brandishing her as terror in the service of order. Zeus looked upon the shield and approved its brilliance. Hermes spoke of the cleverness that had made a mortal youth capable of wielding such dread. None of them mourned her, yet in their silence Medusa sensed unease, as if the permanence of her gaze unsettled even divine certainty. She had been punished to erase her. Yet in that punishment she had become immortal, her eyes outlasting the very faces of the gods who cursed her. Mortals, however, bore her differently. They feared her, yes, but they also trusted her image, wove her into daily ritual. Farmers scratched her serpents onto tools to keep blight away. Sailors carved her eyes upon oars to frighten storms. Even children, once warned of her as nightmare, now wore small amulets with her likeness, believing she would guard their sleep. Medusa, within her spirit, wept silently at this strange turn. She had been abandoned, condemned and slain, was now sought as shield. Her pain had been alchemized into comfort, and yet the ache persisted. Her name was spoken everywhere, but her truth was spoken nowhere. No one told of the maiden wronged in Athena's temple, the girl whose hair once smelled of rosewater, who wove lilies into garlands. That story had vanished beneath layers of fear and reverence. Medusa feared it would vanish forever, her innocence drowned beneath the serpent's hiss. But myths are never still. They breathe, shift and change with the mouths that retell them. Already whispers circulated of her sorrow, of a beauty punished unjustly, of a maiden turned to terror by divine cruelty. These murmurs did not dominate, but they existed, thin as reeds against storm, yet unbroken. In them she felt hope, fragile but real, that some would remember she had not been born a monster but made one. The sky turned, and years uncoiled like serpents slipping through grass. Battles rose and fell beneath her glare. Rulers placed her effigy upon coins. Cities inscribed her likeness into stone. Her presence became less fearsome over time, and more protective, until people invoked her as guardian rather than curse. The line between terror and sanctuary blurred, and in that blur her legacy expanded. She was both, she was neither. She was mystery, paradox, and permanence. And still, within the quiet of her essence, she wondered, would the world ever know her true face? Would anyone remember the maiden she once was? Or would history forever wear only her serpents and her stare? The wind that swept across temples and shields seemed to answer with silence, but beneath that silence she sensed something stirring. The gods had not finished weaving her tale. Her name, already vast, was not yet at its final form. The ache within her deepened, but so too did the certainty that her presence would continue to grow, carried forward not only in bronze and stone, but in the imaginations of generations yet unborn. The stars emerged once more, their light scattering like fragments of shattered mirrors, and Medusa's essence lingered within that glow. Somewhere ahead, destiny still waited, a turning that would stretch her further into myth, deeper into eternity, and she braced herself. For even in death, her transformation was not complete. The stars dimmed into dawn once more, and the world moved under their quiet withdrawal. Athena's aegis still carried the Gorgon's head, its serpents frozen mid-hiss, its eyes unblinking, its presence a mantle of awe and dread. Mortals continued to shape their lives around it, invoking Medusa as both curse and sanctuary, yet within the stillness of that emblem, Medusa's spirit lingered, feeling each invocation like ripples upon a vast unseen lake. She had become a paradox that mortals both feared and clung to. When storms threatened ships, captains pressed amulets carved with her likeness against their chests. When plagues crept through villages, mothers tied tokens of her face above doorways. Armies engraved her image upon shields, not only to strike fear into foes, but to guard themselves against misfortune. Her presence, once confined to exile, now stretched across every province touched by Greek tongue. Medusa had been meant as warning, yet she had become necessity, but necessity too is double-edged. For every prayer whispered in reverence, there were curses spit into the wind, stories retold in anger of her monstrousness. Children were told she was horror incarnate, that her very breath could poison air, that she had deserved her fate. Medusa felt these words like cold stones cast upon her memory, each one burying the girl she had once been deeper beneath the rubble of myth. The world wanted her both feared and loved, yet neither truly seen, and still her essence endured. She drifted where her blood had sown life. Pegasus, whose wings beat silver against the sky, whose hooves cracked springs of inspiration from earth, and Chrysaor, steadfast, whose path wound through war and destiny. Through them she breathed. Though they bore no memory of her sorrow, Pegasus soared in freedom, carrying poets into heights of imagination, while she, their mother, remained bound within emblem and shadow. The irony pierced her, yet it comforted her too. Some part of her had escaped exile, some fragment had taken flight. The gods spoke little of her, but their silence was not dismissal. Zeus approved the Aegis, Hermes praised the cleverness of its dread, and Athena bore it into battles where cities were defended and tyrants subdued. Each time her gaze flared from the shield, soldiers faltered, pride collapsed, hubris shattered. Medusa's power served order, her curse turned to discipline. Yet she felt no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the injustice that had birthed it. She remained tool, not soul. Still, she endured, because endurance was all that remained to her. Among mortals, whispers began to shift. Some wondered aloud if she had truly deserved her fate. They questioned the gods' cruelty, the unfairness of punishing beauty, the cruelty of exile for one whose only sin was being desired. These whispers were faint, fragile as reeds in storm, but they stirred her spirit. She leaned into them, into the possibility that her true story might surface one day, not as warning but as lament. Artists carried these whispers into marble and clay. Some sculpted her with fangs and fury, serpents coiled like storms. Others dared carve her softer, eyes lowered, sorrow etched upon her brow. In those works, Medusa glimpsed herself reflected with humanity intact. They did not absolve her, nor erase the terror she had become, but they remembered that terror was not her beginning. In art, at least, fragments of her innocence survived. Yet time pressed on, and with it, new wars, new rulers, new uses for her gaze. Athena bore her into conflicts not yet imagined, her image becoming synonymous with divine order. Medusa, within that emblem, felt herself stretched thinner, scattered across countless shields, countless coins, countless amulets. She was everywhere and nowhere, both personal and impersonal, feared and cherished, forgotten and immortalized. It was a strange kind of existence, one that blurred the line between life and dream. Sometimes, in the hush between battles, she remembered her cave. She remembered walking among the statues of those who had stumbled upon her, whispering apologies to them, weeping silently into the stone silence. She remembered the salt wind upon the cliffs, the endless hymn of the sea. Those memories, painful as they were, felt more real than the bronze gleam of the Aegis. In them she was still herself, still woman, still sorrowful heart. Now she was myth, stretched so far that the girl within seemed almost extinguished. And yet she was not extinguished. She was still here, present in every invocation, in every carving, in every whispered prayer or curse. She had been transformed many times, maiden into victim, victim into monster, monster into weapon, weapon into guardian. Each transformation had stripped something from her, yet also added something new. She was a palimpsest, a story written over and over, but never erased. The sky deepened into twilight, and Medusa felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable. Her legacy was still unfolding, carried not only by gods and warriors, but by the imaginations of mortals who would never see her face yet, would live beneath her shadow. The serpents, etched into bronze, seemed to whisper softly even in stillness, as if promising that her tale would stretch further still. And as the stars returned, scattering across the night like fragments of shattered mirrors, Medusa's spirit braced itself once more. For myths do not end where their bodies fall. They ripple forward, reshaping, reinterpreted, reborn in each retelling. Her transformation, far from finished, still wound onward into the fabric of eternity. The stars scattered like embers across the night, and beneath their glow the world carried her likeness still. Coins clinked in merchants' hands, stamped with her serpents. Shields gleamed in firelight, her frown cast upon their curves. Temples wore her eyes above their gates, unblinking guardians against shadows. Medusa, though slain, though cursed, though transformed beyond recognition, remained everywhere, woven into the fabric of mortal life. She was at once absence and abundance, a presence felt more strongly in death than in any moment of her exile. Within this vast dispersal her spirit drifted, neither at rest nor in torment. She lingered in the awe of children tracing her carved face, in the fear of soldiers meeting her eyes upon bronze, in the quiet hope of mothers placing her token above a cradle. Each of these moments sustained her, though none recalled her truth. They saw only monster, only dread transfigured into protection. The maiden who once knelt in temples, hair perfumed with rose water, eyes lifted in innocence, had been lost to memory, and yet, in rare whispers, in quiet poems, she felt the faint pulse of recognition, fragile but real. Like grass pushing through stone, Athena bore her upon the Aegis still, a shield that turned armies away, that carved silence into the chaos of battle. Each time the goddess lifted it, Medusa's presence surged outward like tide, striking fear, unraveling pride. She had become inseparable from the very notion of divine protection. Her curse absorbed into law, her dread made servant of wisdom. Yet she knew it was not reverence but utility that bound her there. Athena had not forgiven her, nor restored her, but simply placed her where she could serve. Still, within that placement, Medusa endured, and endurance itself became her defiance. The serpents whispered to her in stillness, their hiss soft as reeds in wind. They seemed to say that she had not been erased, only reshaped. and that every reshaping carried fragments of the girl she once was. In their chorus she heard the echo of her cave, where she had once walked among statues, whispering apologies. That memory did not fade, it accompanied her like shadow. She remained paradox, beauty punished, terror venerated, sorrow transfigured into symbol. Her children too carried her essence. Pegasus soared, hooves striking fountains from earth, wings scattering dew across dawn. Poets drank from the springs he summoned and wrote verses that would echo through centuries. Chrysaor, solid and steadfast, bore his own destiny, his form a reminder of strength, born from grief. Through them Medusa's blood became creation, and she wondered if they carried even a trace of her memory, or if their lives were free of her sorrow. If they did not remember her, she did not begrudge it. It was enough that her essence had given rise to beauty unchained and strength enduring. Mortals continued to mould her into what they needed. For some she was horror eternal, a nightmare whispered to children in darkness. For others she was guardian, her frown protecting doorways, her gaze averting evil. Each retelling remade her, stripped her, added to her, until she was no longer one thing but many. She was not simply the girl, nor the monster, nor the weapon. She was all of them at once, a tapestry of contradictions that refused unraveling. Medusa sensed the weight of time deepening. Already generations had passed since her fall, yet her presence did not weaken. If anything, it grew stronger, multiplying across lands and languages. Myths have roots deeper than stone, and hers wound through the foundations of cities. She had been meant as warning, yet she had become pillar, a truth that could not be avoided. She was reminder and protector, curse and comfort, sorrow and strength. She was permanence, and yet within her spirit the ache remained. She longed not for worship, nor for fear, but for recognition, that someone might remember her not as symbol but as self, that someone might speak her name with compassion, recalling the girl who once belonged to light before shadows claimed her. Perhaps such recognition would never come, yet even without it, her endurance had meaning. If she could not be remembered truly, she would at least never be forgotten falsely. She would haunt memory until it bent toward truth. The night deepened, and winds carried her name like secret through valleys, across seas, into mouths that would never know her face. Each whisper added to her immortality. She had been transformed many times, and she knew more transformations lay ahead. For myths are not statues. They move, they shift, they change with each telling. She braced herself, her serpents whispering softly for the next unfolding of her story. And as the horizon paled with the first promise of dawn, Medusa's spirit felt the weight of eternity settle gently upon her. She had been beauty turned to beast, beast turned to emblem, emblem turned to guardian. Yet her journey was not finished. The world would carry her further still, reshaping her again and again, until the end of memory itself. The dawn came quietly, pale as washed linen, spilling over fields where shepherds guided their flocks, over harbours where ships bore amulets with her face, over cities where her image crowned gates and temples. Time moved steadily, and with it Medusa's presence thickened, not diminished. She was no longer only a tale whispered by firelight, but a truth carved into stone and bronze, woven into daily life like thread that could not be unpicked. Her likeness stretched into lands beyond Greece, carried by traders who knew that symbols travel faster than ships. In distant ports her face was stamped upon pottery, her serpents coiled upon shields of foreign kings. Strangers who had never spoken her name correctly still feared her eyes, still trusted her scowl to ward away evil. Medusa had become larger than her own sorrow, her myth swelling beyond recognition. But within that vastness her spirit lingered, quiet and steady, feeling every invocation like the tide pressing against a shore. Yet she remained divided. Part of her recoiled at being remembered only as monster, as dreadful warning, as weapon wielded in service of others. Another part, weary of longing, accepted that even in distortion she had found permanence. The gods had not erased her, they had only reshaped her and reshaped again and again until she had become many things at once. Her curse had become her crown, her exile her immortality. Athena still bore her head upon the aegis, the shield flashing in wars that reshaped cities. When enemies faltered at its gleam, Medusa felt herself surge outward, no longer bound by sack or silence. She was force incarnate, a reminder that arrogance is brittle, that beauty twisted into terror still holds power. But when the battles ended and the shield was hung in stillness, she lingered in the quiet, remembering lilies, remembering laughter, remembering the girl she had once been. The ache of that memory never left her, though centuries piled upon it like dust upon marble. Her children lived on as well, each carrying fragments of her story. Pegasus soared among clouds, hooves striking springs that inspired poets. Medusa felt a strange comfort knowing her blood had given rise to beauty that inspired rather than petrified. Chrysaor walked his own path, solid and steady, the other half of her legacy. Through them, she was mother, not only monster, creator, as well as destroyer. Their existence softened her sorrow, even as it sharpened the irony of her fate. Among mortals, interpretations of her tale multiplied. Some insisted she was horror incarnate, deserving of her end. Others whispered she was victim, punished unjustly for what she could not control. Artists began to experiment, painting her not as beast, but as tragic figure, eyes heavy with grief, serpents resting like companions rather than threats. Each retelling bent her image slightly, like light refracting through water, and Medusa, though voiceless, felt each version touch her, some like balm, others like salt upon wounds. Time, relentless, turned empires into dust. Cities rose and fell beneath the same stars that had watched her birth, her exile, her death. Yet her presence did not fade with them. She clung to memory, to stone, to story, more enduring than the walls of kings. The gods themselves shifted, their names spoken less often, their temples crumbling. But Medusa remained etched into thresholds, still called upon by those who feared misfortune. She had become something greater than even divine punishment. She was enduring myth, indelible, impossible to silence. And within this immortality she found a new kind of defiance. The gods had cursed her to be feared, and feared she was, but she had turned that fear into power, that power into protection, that protection into permanence. Even in distortion she had refused to vanish. She had refused to be erased. The serpents upon her brow whispered this truth in endless chorus. Once they had been symbols of her curse, now they were heralds of her endurance. Their hiss was not only menace, but reminder. She had survived transformation after transformation, and still she remained. Maiden into monster, monster into weapon, weapon into guardian, each form a layer, each layer refusing erasure. The wind carried whispers of her name across seas, through ruins, into the mouths of those who would never know her sorrow but who nonetheless felt her presence. Medusa drifted within those whispers, not at rest, but no longer alone. She had companions in memory, companions in symbol, companions in the countless souls who traced her likeness for courage. And as night settled once more, stars scattering like shards of glass across the sky, Medusa sensed another turning of her story. She was no longer only past, no longer only symbol. She was becoming something more, something deeper, her presence stretching beyond temples and shields, into the imagination itself. She was no longer simply remembered. She was interpreted, reimagined, reborn in thought after thought. Her transformation, long and sorrowful, was still not complete. Something waited beyond, a final unfolding that would decide how she would endure in the hearts of those yet to come. And so she lingered, patient as stone, watchful as stars, ready for the next chapter destiny would carve. The night deepened, and with it the weight of her story pressed heavier upon the world. Medusa's face, carved into stone and stamped into bronze, had become so familiar that people forgot it had ever belonged to a woman. They saw only symbol, guardian, monster, protector, everything but the fragile girl whose life had been broken in the temple of Athena. Yet within her spirit, lingering like a flame that refused to be extinguished, she remembered with clarity sharper than marble, and through that remembrance she endured. Centuries gathered, empires shifting like clouds, temples rose to gods and fell into ruin, but Medusa's visage remained, weathering time with patience. On city gates her eyes still glared outward, promising to turn away evil. In marketplaces, amulets still rattled in the hands of merchants, invoking her power. Even as other deities waned, her image lingered, not because it was worshipped, but because it was needed. She had transcended divine favor, entering the realm of necessity itself. Yet with necessity came distortion. Some storytellers darkened her further, painting her as embodiment of chaos, the primal terror beneath all order. Others softened her, daring to suggest she had been wronged, daring to sing of her sorrow in tones gentler than fear. These conflicting voices wove her myth into a fabric of contradiction, each thread pulling in different directions. Medusa felt each tug, each reshaping, but none could sever the core of her being. She was transformation itself, a living paradox. Pegasus still soared across skies, the gift of her blood, his wings striking fountains from mountain sides. Chrysaor still walked the earth, a warrior of strength and shadow. They carried her essence forward, though they bore no memory of her face. She wondered if they sensed in some distant part of their being that they were born of both beauty and sorrow, that their existence was the flowering of a wound. In them she was both mother and myth, both grief and creation. Athena continued to wield her upon the aegis, a constant presence in battles that reshaped the map of men. Medusa, fixed in bronze, saw cities burn, saw tyrants topple, saw empires stagger into silence. Each time her gaze flared, armies trembled, but when the clamour subsided, she was again only emblem. Athena gave no word of pity, no recognition of the human heart that had once beat beneath the serpents. Yet Medusa sensed the goddess's silence was not indifference alone. Perhaps Athena feared to look too long upon what she had made, to admit the cruelty braided into order. Among mortals, however, compassion grew slowly, like grass through stone. Women in particular felt kinship with her tale. They whispered that she was not monster, but mirror, reflecting the weight of injustice cast upon beauty, the punishment inflicted upon innocence. They saw in her not only terror, but survival, not only curse, but power reclaimed. Medusa felt their voices like balm upon her wounds, faint yet steady, small yet true. In those whispers she was remembered not as beast, but as woman. The winds of time shifted further. Artists began to paint her with sorrowful eyes, serpents resting like guardians, rather than attackers. Poets wrote of her voice, silenced too soon, of her beauty turned against her by envy. Philosophers debated her meaning, asking if monsters were born or made, if punishment could create more terror than it erased. In these questions, Medusa found new life. Her story had become more than warning. It had become reflection, forcing mortals to look inward at their own cruelty. And so, even in silence, she spoke. Even in death she endured. She had been transformed beyond recognition. Yet in those transformations she had become eternal. The gods had cursed her to erase her beauty, but in doing so they had preserved her name forever. The maiden with rose-scented hair was gone, but the Gorgon with serpents for crown had become undying. Still, her spirit longed for completion. She sensed that her story was not yet finished, that the world had more to draw from her, more meanings to carve, more truths to uncover. Myths are not endings, but seeds, and she felt herself stretching like root through the soil of centuries, reaching toward futures unseen. The stars wheeled above, ancient and patient, watching her endurance. Mortals below continued to tell her tale, shaping her into guardian, into terror, into lament, into warning. Each telling was imperfect, yet each ensured she was never forgotten. She was carved into memory itself, unerasable. And in the quiet between those tellings, Medusa waited. She felt the weight of time pressing forward, carrying her toward another transformation, perhaps the final one, perhaps only another turning. The serpents whispered softly, steady as tide, as if to remind her that patience was her strength now. Her beauty had been punished, her innocence shattered, her form twisted into terror. Yet from that terror had risen guardianship, endurance and paradoxical reverence. She had been turned from girl into monster, from monster into symbol, and from symbol into something larger still, a mirror held to the world itself. The night hushed, and Medusa's spirit lingered, sensing the next horizon, for myths do not end. They ripple forward, reshaping themselves in every age. She had become not only part of Greece, not only part of legend, but part of human thought itself, and though the girl within her still longed for recognition, she now knew that her true legacy would be larger than any single face remembered. Something beyond awaited, quiet but certain, as the stars burned and the world turned toward yet another dawn. The centuries drifted onward, carrying her name as faithfully as waves carry salt. Medusa's visage, once confined to the aegis of Athena and the amulets of sailors, spread into every corner where myth and memory touched. Her eyes, carved into lintels painted upon pottery, struck both fear and comfort into hearts that had never known the cliffs of her exile, or the cavern of her solitude. She had become more than story. She was atmosphere, an unseen presence folded into the fabric of life. And yet, within the deep silence of her spirit, she felt the weight of misremembering. Too many told her tale with cruelty, casting her only as nightmare, a beast to be feared. Too few recalled the innocence shattered, the sanctity violated, the transformation imposed upon her. Her sorrow whispered still, though muffled beneath layers of legend. It was as if the world preferred to forget that monsters are made, not born. She had been sculpted into terror, and terror was all most chose to see, but whispers of compassion persisted. A poet, gazing upon the ruins of a fallen temple, wrote verses of her beauty before the curse, verses so tender that they spread like wildfire, softening her image in the minds of those who heard them. A sculptor, chiseling her likeness into marble, dared to show not fangs but a weary mouth, not fury but sorrow in her eyes. These small acts, fragile as reeds bending against wind, offered her a measure of recognition. They did not erase the centuries of distortion, but they allowed a sliver of truth to pierce the veil. Her children too carried her forward. Pegasus soared higher than clouds, his hooves striking springs of inspiration from rock. Poets drank from those waters, and sang of beauty, of tragedy, of transformation, echoes of Medusa's own journey, disguised in other tales. Chrysa all bore strength and steadiness, a reminder that even from wounds come warriors. Through them she was present not only in dread, but in creation. Their existence was her quiet triumph, proof that even from blood spilled in violence could rise life unyielding. Athena's aegis still bore her head, flashing in battles that decided the fate of cities. Each time her gaze turned armies to silence, Medusa felt her spirit surge outward, no longer passive but active, woven into the very rhythm of order and chaos. She had become indispensable to the goddess, not as companion but as tool. Yet even so, Medusa recognized the irony. The one who had cursed her now relied upon her curse. Her sorrow had been weaponized, her transformation repurposed as divine justice. If Athena sensed the cruelty of that paradox, she gave no sign. Silence was her answer, as it had always been. Mortals, however, were less silent. Their interpretations shifted with each generation. Some sang of Medusa as emblem of wrath, others as symbol of feminine power, others still as warning against hubris. She had become mirror for every age, reflecting its fears, its desires, its injustices. Medusa, voiceless though she was, endured these reflections with patience, knowing that myths are not fixed. They breathe, they change, they reveal as much about those who tell them as about those they describe. And so her presence expanded beyond Greece, carried into lands that spoke other tongues, lands that worshipped other gods. Her serpents hissed upon shields borne by soldiers who had never heard of Athena. Her eyes glared from gates in cities where her name was mangled, yet still invoked. She had become universal, not bound to place or pantheon. Medusa had transcended the very gods who cursed her, her story outlasting their temples. In this strange eternity, she found a measure of strength. Though she still longed for recognition of her true self, she realized that she had become unraceable. She had been transformed into monster, but in that form she had become immortal. Her beauty had been punished, but her curse had made her indispensable. The gods had sought to bury her beneath dread, but in doing so they had lifted her into legend. She had been both victim and victor, both erased and eternal. The serpents upon her brow whispered this truth each night, their hiss steady as tide. They were not only curse but chorus, singing of transformation, reminding her that no matter how distorted her image became, the essence of her endured. Myths might change, retellings might twist, but the core remained. Medusa had been beauty punished into terror, and from that terror had risen a legacy no blade could sever. As another dawn rose, painting the sky in pale fire, Medusa felt the pull of yet another transformation. Her story was no longer only about fear or protection, it was becoming reflection, a question posed to every heart. What do we create when we punish what we do not understand? That question, subtle as breath, would ripple through ages, outlasting bronze, outlasting marble, outlasting even the names of gods. She lingered in that thought, her spirit steady, as the world turned toward new horizons. Her journey was not finished, for myths never finish. They evolve, they echo, they endure, and Medusa, cursed and immortal, sorrowful and enduring, waited for the next shaping of her name, certain that it too would carry fragments of her truth. The dawn washed the marble ruins of forgotten temples, casting pale gold upon stones that once echoed with prayers. The gods, their names fading, their statues crumbling, retreated into silence, but Medusa's face still endured. Her likeness, carved into lintels and pressed into coins, did not vanish with their worship. She had slipped beyond the cycle of divine rise and fall, belonging no longer to a single pantheon, but to the human heart that clung to her image. In villages, amulets with her serpents guarded doorways, their bronze edges worn smooth by countless hands. In cities, her gaze still crowned the gates, daring evil to enter. Merchants swore that her likeness protected their goods. Sailors trusted her to tame storms. Mothers whispered her name in the dark to drive away nightmares. Her presence had softened with time, less the terror of instant petrification, more the steady sentinel that endured in silence. She had become guardian of thresholds liminal as ever, standing between safety and threat, light and shadow. And yet within her spirit the ache remained, for though she was honoured in form, her truth was still hidden. The maiden wronged in Athena's temple, the girl who once dreamed of devotion and peace, had been nearly erased. In her place stood 1,000 interpretations. Monster, protector, punishment, emblem, but the girl had not vanished. She still lived within, remembering lilies pressed to marble, remembering laughter stolen too soon. That remembrance made her more than symbol, it made her whole. Whispers of her humanity did not die, though fragile. A philosopher asked in quiet writings whether beauty punished becomes not monster but mirror, showing society its cruelty. An artist painted her not with fangs bared but with eyes downcast, serpents curling softly around her shoulders like companions. A poet dared to write her lament in her own voice, imagining the sorrow that no one had allowed her to speak. These rare acts touched her spirit, small ripples across the sea of distortion, but enough to assure her she had not been entirely lost to misunderstanding. Pegasus still soared, hooves striking fountains of inspiration, carrying poets to heights where song was born. Chrysaor endured, embodying strength and steadfastness. They carried her essence even when they did not know her face, even when they did not remember her sorrow. Their lives were proof that even blood spilled in violence could give rise to beauty and might. In them, she was both mother and myth, both tragedy and triumph. Athena still bore her head upon the aegis, flashing it in moments of peril. Medusa's presence turned armies to silence, arrested the chaos of battle, preserved the order the goddess demanded. Yet, this too was paradox. Her punishment had become indispensable. The very curse meant to isolate her now stood at the center of protection. If Athena ever wondered at the cruelty entwined with such reliance, she gave no answer. Medusa did not expect one. The silence of gods is vast, but mortals carried forward what gods left behind. Their voices, uncertain and varied, began to shift. Some still cursed her name, whispering of her monstrousness. Others began to claim her as symbol of resistance, of power reclaimed from cruelty, of survival born from suffering. Each age bent her story to its own reflection, making her not only memory but mirror. Medusa, voiceless, watched these tellings unfold. She understood at last that her immortality was not only in bronze or stone, but in interpretation. Myths are not statues. They breathe, they change, they endure through thought as much as through form. In this endurance, Medusa found something like peace. Not rest, not forgiveness, but a calm recognition that her story would never die. The gods might fade, the cities crumble, but her name would linger on lips, her gaze carved into thresholds, her serpents etched into memory. She had become larger than curse, larger than punishment. She had become enduring question. What happens when beauty is broken, when innocence is punished, when power is born of pain? That question would ripple through ages, and through it she would endure. The stars wheeled once more, patient as ever. Their light touched the ruins, the shields, the amulets, the coins, all places where her likeness endured. Medusa's spirit lingered in that glow, quiet but unyielding, as if preparing for one final transformation. She sensed it coming, not in thunder or flame, but in silence, the silence of understanding, of reflection, of story reaching its end. The serpents upon her brow whispered steadily, their hiss like waves against eternal cliffs. She was still here. She would always be here. And yet, beyond presence, something more awaited, resolution, a final weaving of all the strands, maiden, monster, mother, guardian, into a truth that would outlast even myth itself. As night thinned toward another dawn, Medusa braced herself for that closing. For though she had been punished into monstrosity, wielded as weapon, worshipped as guardian, and remade as symbol, her story was not yet complete. One final chapter remained, where all that she had become would be gathered, reflected, and laid gently to rest. The last dawn rose slow and tender, gilding the ruins of temples, the crests of shields, the worn amulets hanging at doorways. All bore her likeness still. Medusa's eyes, carved, painted, stamped, no longer turned flesh to stone, but they lingered as silent guardians of memory. The centuries had not erased her. They had only deepened her, layering meanings upon her name, until she was no longer a single story, but a constellation of truths. Within her spirit she felt the long weight of time folding inward. She had been maiden once, kneeling with rosewater in her hands, lifting her eyes to gods who would not shield her. She had been victim, punished for the crime of beauty, punished for being seen. She had been monster, serpents hissing upon her brow, her gaze feared, her presence shunned. She had been mother, giving birth in death to Pegasus and Chrysaor, beings of flight and strength. She had been weapon, fixed upon Athena's aegis, striking silence into battlefields, and she had been guardian, her face pressed into stone above thresholds, her image trusted as ward against misfortune. Each transformation had taken something, yet each had also left something behind. They had stripped her of innocence, yet clothed her in endurance. They had broken her body, yet carried her essence into eternity. They had erased her beauty, yet made her immortal. She was paradox, woven from sorrow and strength, cruelty and creation. And now, at the long end of telling, she understood that this was her true form, not maiden, not monster, but enduring myth. The serpents upon her brow whispered softly, no longer with menace, but with calm. They seemed to sing of completion, of story arriving gently at its shore. They had been her curse, her companions, her crown. They had hissed in loneliness, coiled in fury, guarded her in exile, and even in death they had endured with her. Now their hiss was lullaby, soothing her into acceptance. She felt the world carry her forward even as she let go. Poets would still write of her. Sculptors would still carve her. Philosophers would still question her. But her spirit no longer strained against misunderstanding. She accepted that no single telling could hold her truth. She was too vast, too layered, too complex for any one voice to define. She was monster and maiden, victim and guardian, symbol and self. She was all of these at once, and none alone. The gods had long since withdrawn, their temples crumbling, their names fading. Athena still bore the aegis in legend, but even that story softened with time, shifting into symbol more than weapon. Mortals, however, kept Medusa alive. In every age they retold her, reshaped her, repurposed her. Each time they did, they revealed themselves as much as her. In that mirror she endured not only as myth but as question. What is beauty? What is power? What is justice? What is survival? She had become the silent riddle laid at humanity's feet, and so she lingered in eternity. Not restless now, but still. The ache of misremembering had not vanished, but it had lessened, soothed by the knowledge that whispers of truth had never died, that compassion had slowly grown, that remembrance, though distorted, had carried her farther than she ever could have walked. She had not been erased, she had been magnified. The sea that once sang outside her cave still roared, still broke upon cliffs, still carried salt into the air. The same wind that had once tangled her hair still crossed the earth, brushing over fields and cities where her image endured. The same stars that had watched her exile still burned, unblinking, their light falling on ruins and on the faces of those who whispered her name in wonder or fear. Time had flowed, empires had fallen, but she remained, steady as those stars, unyielding as that sea. And in this steadiness, she found her resolution. She was no longer waiting to be remembered as maiden. She was no longer mourning only what she had lost. She was accepting what she had become. Her beauty had been punished, her innocence shattered, her body destroyed. Yet from that ruin had risen a legacy eternal, a name carved into memory deeper than marble, wider than empires, more enduring than gods. Medusa, once girl, once monster, once symbol, now belonged to eternity itself. Her story had reached its end, not in erasure, but in permanence. She was proof that even in punishment there can be power, that even in distortion there can be endurance, that even in silence there can be voice. The night settled one last time, stars scattering like silver dust across the sky. The serpents coiled gently, the hiss fading into stillness. Medusa's spirit rested at last, not in exile, not in torment, but in timeless reflection. She had been beauty, she had been beast, and she had become something greater than both. She had become myth, eternal and unbroken, And so her story closes not with stone, not with sorrow, but with quiet permanence. Her name carried forward forever, a mirror for every age, a reminder that transformation itself is the deepest immortality.